Section 1. The Quiet World of Lost Media and Why Family Guy Keeps Its Secrets. There is something deeply soothing about the night, that particular hour when the house has gone quiet, when everything around you has settled into stillness, and the only thing moving is your own breathing and the soft glow of whatever screen you are watching. It is in moments like this that the mind reaches for something that feels safe and familiar, something known, something warm. And for a very particular generation of people, that thing is Family Guy. The show has been part of people's late nights for over 2 decades now. It has been the background noise of college dorm rooms and the quiet companion of people who could not sleep. The voices of Peter and Brian and Stewie drifting through a bedroom at 2 in the morning carry a specific kind of comfort that is hard to explain, but very easy to feel. There is a reason people put Family Guy on when they want to relax. There is a reason it has lived at the top of streaming charts for years, even as the episodes themselves have aged and changed. It is familiarity. It is the warmth of something you have watched 100 times before. But tonight, we are not watching the familiar version. Tonight, we are going somewhere quieter and stranger. Tonight, we are following the pieces of Family Guy that most people never saw. The episodes that were locked away. The scenes that were cut before they could reach anyone's screen. The characters whose stories took unexpected turns in production, long before a single frame was ever animated. The mysteries buried inside a show that has been running for over 25 years. Mysteries that its own creators have never fully explained. There is a whole world of media that exists in a state between being and not being. Pieces of film and television that were made, that were nearly released, that were pulled at the last moment, that were changed so dramatically that almost nothing of the original survives. The study of this material even has a name. People call it lost media. And the community built around finding and preserving these fragments is one of the quietest and most dedicated corners of the internet. These are people who spend years hunting down a single rough cut or a discarded script, driven by a need to understand something that was hidden. Family Guy has more of this material than almost any other animated series in history. Part of that is because the show has been running for so long. Part of it is because of the 2 cancellations and revivals that scrambled its production timeline in ways that are still not fully understood. Part of it is because the show has pushed so hard against the limits of what Fox would allow that entire episodes ended up locked in vaults, unavailable and unaired. And part of it is simply because Family Guy, from its very first moment, was built on secrets. Stewie Griffin was a baby with plans that no one around him fully understood. Brian Griffin was a dog with a history that the show only partially revealed. The Griffin family lived in a town that the writers constructed piece by piece, filling it with rules that they sometimes followed and sometimes abandoned. And Seth MacFarlane, the man at the center of all of it, built his show from fragments of his own earlier work, carrying ideas and images and sounds across years of creative evolution before they finally landed on screen. So tonight, we are going to move slowly through all of it, through the origins that most people do not know, through the banned episodes and the pulled scenes and the content that Fox decided the world was not ready for, through the deep character mysteries that were never resolved, through the alternate versions of episodes that existed for weeks or months before being rewritten, through the theories that fans have built over years of watching and rewatching, looking for patterns in a show that was sometimes deliberately ambiguous and sometimes just inconsistent. Let the room go dark. Let yourself get comfortable. There is a lot of ground to cover, and we are in no hurry. Family Guy began in the most literal sense in a dormitory room at the Rhode Island School of Design, sometime in 1994 and 1995. A student named Seth MacFarlane was working on his senior thesis project, and what he produced was not a traditional piece of animation schoolwork. It was a short film called The Life of Larry, running about 11 minutes, and it contained almost everything that would eventually become Family Guy. There was a heavyset middle-aged man named Larry Cummings, his talking dog Steve, a wife named Lois, and an overweight teenage son named Milt. The short had cutaway gags. It had a fast, irreverent sense of humor. It had the specific voice that MacFarlane was already developing, even at that age, And if you watch it today, it is almost eerie how clearly you can see Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin looking back at you through these rougher, earlier forms. The short was submitted by McFarlane's professor at RISD to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation company responsible for The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, and dozens of other iconic cartoons. Hanna-Barbera hired McFarlane, and a year or so later he made a sequel short called Larry and Steve. That second short aired on Cartoon Network in 1997 as part of their What a Cartoon Showcase, a program that existed specifically to give new animated ideas a small public platform. And it was from these two films, these early rough sketches of what would later become something much larger, that executives at Fox eventually saw something worth developing. What is interesting, and what most people do not realize, is that the version of this world that Fox commissioned was not automatic. McFarlane had to pitch it. He had to convince people that what he had was worth the investment. And Fox gave him $50,000 and a request for a 15-minute animated pilot. McFarlane spent the next 6 months, as he later described it, with no sleep and no life, drawing endlessly in his kitchen to bring the pilot to completion. The characters shifted. Larry became Peter Griffin. Steve became Brian Griffin. The son Milt disappeared. Meg and Chris arrived. And into this family was placed one of the most original characters in the history of animated television. A baby named Stewie, whose existence I am going to spend a great deal of time on later in this video. The pilot worked. Fox ordered 13 episodes. The show went into production. And on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, Family Guy aired for the first time in front of 22 million people. But before we follow the show into its strange and complicated history, take a moment to think about what was lost in that transition from the Larry shorts to the finished show. The life of Larry contained jokes and gags that later showed up in early Family Guy episodes, sometimes nearly word for word. The character of Larry had a personality that was clearly the seed of Peter Griffin, but rougher and more urban in feeling. And the dog Steve was already almost entirely Brian, the intellectual animal companion who served as the voice of reason in a world of chaos. The distance between those early shorts and the finished show is smaller than people realize. And that closeness makes you wonder what else was in those rooms that never made it through. That question, what else was in those rooms, is the question that will carry us through every section of this video. If you are watching this right now and you want to drop a comment below with where you are and what time it is, please do. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in a completely different part of the world is listening to the same story at the same strange hour. And while you are down there, a subscription would mean a great deal. It helps more than you might think, and it keeps this kind of quiet, careful content coming. Section 2. The 2 cancellations and what they left behind. There is a kind of grief specific to canceled television. It is not the grief of losing a person or a relationship. It is something quieter and less serious, but still real. It is the feeling of a story being interrupted, of characters who were building towards something suddenly stopping, frozen in whatever state the last episode left them, never moving forward. Most canceled shows stay canceled. The story ends mid-sentence and there is nothing left to do but mourn the chapters that were never written. Family Guy was canceled twice. That detail is well known now, almost a point of pride in the show's mythology. But what is less often examined is what actually happened during those periods of cancellation. What got left behind? What was in progress when the lights went out? What stories were planned that never got made? The first cancellation came in 2000. The show was partway through its second season when Fox, frustrated by falling ratings caused largely by its own chaotic scheduling decisions, began making noises about the show's future. Fox had moved Family Guy from its original spot to Thursday nights, where it competed directly with Frasier on NBC, one of the most popular comedies on television at the time. The ratings dropped. Fox moved it again to Tuesday nights. The ratings dropped further. The network shuffled the show around so many times that the audience could not keep track of when to find it. It was a scheduling failure, not a creative one, but Fox drew the wrong conclusions. By the end of the third season in 2002, the show was officially canceled. The writers scattered. McFarlane moved on to other projects. The voice cast dispersed. And sitting on the shelf, unaired and mostly unknown, was an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. This episode deserves careful attention because it represents the earliest known case of Family Guy being censored and suppressed. It had been written and produced in the year 2000 during the second season. The plot centered on Peter Griffin befriending a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, who helped the Griffin family recover money that Peter had been conned out of. From this experience, Peter drew the deeply flawed conclusion that Jewish people were inherently more capable with money, and decided that the best thing he could do for his son Chris was to have him convert to Judaism. The episode included a musical number called I Need a Jew, a parody of the Disney classic When You Wish Upon a Star. Fox executives read the script and pulled it. Their concern was that the episode could be interpreted as anti-Semitic, that its portrayal of Jewish people through Peter's blunt and ignorant lens, even as satire, crossed a line that the network was not willing to approach. The episode sat on a shelf for 3 full years. Then in 2003, with the show in reruns on Adult Swim and a DVD release already in stores, Cartoon Network aired it on the Adult Swim block. Fox finally broadcast its own edited version in December of 2004. What the full story of this episode reveals is not just a single censorship decision. It reveals how early the tension between the show's creative direction and Fox's comfort level began. The show was barely a year old when Fox looked at one of its scripts and said no, and the episode in question, which most people today consider relatively mild and genuinely satirical rather than hateful, spent 3 years in limbo because of institutional anxiety about how it might be received. The Lost Media wiki community later uncovered something even more interesting. There was an early draft of the Weinstein episode that was different from the version that eventually aired. A script for what appeared to be an earlier table read of the episode surfaced in 2024 and was uploaded publicly in July 2025. The original version apparently had enough differences in content and tone that it was sent for a significant rewrite, shifting production codes and bumping other episodes backward in the schedule. So there are effectively 2 versions of this episode, only one of which most people have ever seen. The original draft, the one that apparently cleared the room at a table read in a way that led to it being substantially changed, represents a fragment of a story that was already altered before it was suppressed. During the 3 years between the first cancellation and the 2005 revival, other things were happening too. The DVD releases of seasons 1 and 2 sold over 400,000 copies, which at the time was a remarkable number for a canceled animated series. These sales, combined with the extraordinary ratings the reruns were pulling on Adult Swim, where Family Guy drove a 239% increase in viewership for the block, created an economic argument that Fox could not ignore. The show was being discovered by a completely new generation of viewers through late-night cable reruns. People were watching episodes at 1 and 2 in the morning and then telling their friends about them the next day. The cult was building in the dark, quietly and without Fox's involvement. But here's the thing that rarely gets discussed. The hiatus did not just allow a cult to develop. It also created a gap in what the show could be. 3 years of scattered writers, of creative momentum interrupted, of story arcs that were planned but never executed. The writers who had built the tone of the early seasons moved on to other projects. When the show came back in 2005, MacFarlane himself acknowledged that one of the consequences of the show being canceled was that they were always having to restaff the writing room. Each cancellation scattered the team. Each revival brought in new people with different sensibilities. What was planned for the end of the 3rd season and the beginning of a theoretical 4th season that never happened in 2002? That is largely unknown. There are fragments, pieces of information from interviews over the years, suggestions that certain character arcs were in development. Stewie's villainy was meant to escalate. There were plans for more elaborate world domination storylines. Brian's relationship with Lois, his unspoken feelings for her, was meant to be explored in more depth. The Meg storyline was, in those early years, genuinely meant to give her a more substantial character arc than she eventually received. None of that happened on schedule. The interruption reset everything. And the show that came back in 2005 was building partially on blueprints that had been drawn and then abandoned, and then partially reconstructed from memory. There is a particular kind of melancholy in thinking about the Family Guy that might have been. The show that would have existed if the schedule had not been disrupted, if the writers had stayed together, if the creative momentum of those first 3 seasons had carried straight into a fourth without a 3-year break. That version of Family Guy exists nowhere. It is the most lost of all the lost material connected to this show. The second cancellation came faster and was even more abrupt. Fox had already put the show on thin ice during its second season. The network shuffled it so many times that by the middle of the third season, it was airing in Tuesday night slots against competition that made it almost impossible to build an audience. When the numbers dropped low enough, the decision was made and the show was canceled for the second time in 2002. But by this point, something interesting had already happened in the culture. The show's first season DVD had been released while the show was still technically airing. People were not just watching Family Guy, they were owning it. They were building a physical relationship with episodes they could re-watch whenever they wanted. The disc format gave the show a permanence that the chaotic broadcast schedule never could. And on Adult Swim, reruns were running to audiences that had not grown up watching Fox in the same way, and were completely open to this specific brand of comedy. The story of Family Guy between its second cancellation and its 2005 revival is essentially the story of how a show can outgrow its own death. The economic case for bringing it back became undeniable, and so Fox made the call, and a fourth season was ordered, and for the second time in the show's history, the writers had to reconstruct a creative team and find the thread of what the show was supposed to be. Section 3. The Lost Pilot and the First Discarded Concepts. The 15-minute pilot that Seth MacFarlane created for Fox in 1998 was never publicly broadcast in its original form. That detail alone is enough to make it a fascinating piece of lost media. MacFarlane spent 6 months producing this thing with his own hands, largely alone in his kitchen, surviving on almost no sleep to meet the deadline Fox had given him. The finished pilot convinced Fox to order a full series, and then it was essentially put aside, replaced by the polished first episode that audiences actually watched in January 1999. The pilot and the first episode that aired are not the same thing. They share DNA. They cover roughly similar ground. But the pilot is rougher, the designs are less refined, and certain character elements are different enough to feel like a different show in the early stages of becoming itself. What is particularly interesting about the pilot is what it reveals about the creative decisions that were made in the gap between MacFarlane finishing it and the first episode going into production. The animation style was different, the character proportions were slightly off from what would become canonical. Peter Griffin, in some early materials, had a somewhat different face, rounder in places where the finished version sharpened. Stewie, perhaps most significantly, was conceived with slightly different design notes that were refined over the pilot process. The pilot was eventually released on the Season 1 DVD set, which means it is not entirely inaccessible. But the fact that it was never broadcast, never presented to an audience as a proper introduction to the show, makes it feel like a ghost version of the thing people fell in love with. It is the same story told with slightly different hands, and the differences, though subtle, are real. Beyond the pilot itself, there were earlier concepts that never made it even that far. When MacFarlane was developing the show from his Larry shorts, various character ideas were explored and discarded. The son character in The Life of Larry was named Milt, a heavy-set teenager who bore a much closer resemblance to Chris Griffin than to any of the other Griffin children, but had a personality that was distinct from any character who actually made the final show. Milt disappeared entirely in the move from the shorts to the pitch, and what replaced him was the much more distinct sibling pair of Meg and Chris, each carrying different dimensions of teenage awkwardness. The early design notes for Stewie are particularly worth examining. MacFarlane has spoken in various interviews about the process of developing Stewie, describing the character as inspired partly by Rex Harrison in the 1964 musical My Fair Lady, particularly the voice and the cadence of speech. The idea of an infant who spoke with the precision and elegance of a mid-century British intellectual was part of the concept from very early. But the specifics of what Stewie would want and what he would do were refined over a longer period. In the very earliest conception of the character, Stewie was primarily a commentary on the hidden inner life of infants. The humor was rooted in the idea that babies, with their preverbal frustration and physical helplessness, might harbor genuinely adult-level feelings of rage and ambition. Stewie was the externalization of that idea. He was what it would look like if a baby's interior world could speak. The world domination angle came as that core concept was pushed further into absurdity, following the logic that if an infant's hidden frustration was that extreme, what would be the most extreme possible manifestation of it? And the answer the writers arrived at was a Bond villain. A baby who believed he was entitled to rule everything and was genuinely working toward that goal. This conceptual origin matters because it explains why the early stories of Mama had such a consistent internal logic. He was not random. He was not merely dark for the sake of darkness. He had a reason for everything he did that made sense within his own warped framework. The comedy came from the gap between his self-image as a terrifying overlord and the reality of his situation as a diaper-wearing infant in a high chair. That gap was the whole engine of the character. But there were early concepts for Stewie that pushed him even further in directions the show ultimately did not go. There were ideas for storylines in which Stewie's intelligence was made even more explicit, where his plans for world domination were given specific geopolitical dimensions. There were early script ideas in which Stewie interacted with characters from outside the family in ways that revealed just how much he understood about the adult world around him. Most of these ideas were simplified in the final show, where the comedy was kept tighter by leaving Stewie's schemes somewhat vague and focusing the humor on the contrast between his ambition and his circumstances. One of the more fascinating lost concepts from this early period involves the question of who could hear Stewie. In the very first season, the show had an inconsistent approach to this. Some characters seemed to understand him, others clearly did not. The adults in the house generally responded to Stewie as if he were babbling rather than speaking, but there were moments where a reaction shot from Lois or Peter suggested they had heard something. The writers themselves have acknowledged that this was never fully settled in the early seasons. It was one of those questions that the show left productively ambiguous rather than definitively answering. But there were early discussions about making the "who can hear Stewie" question a central mystery. The idea was floated that Stewie's ability to communicate with Brian and not with others might be given a specific in-world explanation. Perhaps something connected to Brian's own unusual nature as a talking dog. Perhaps something about the specific wavelength of infant vocalization. These ideas were explored in the writer's room and then set aside, the show choosing to keep the ambiguity rather than lock itself into an explanation that would constrain future stories. The specific decision not to explain it became itself a creative choice. The question of whether anyone can really hear Stewie runs underneath the entire series like a quiet thread that was deliberately left untied. And when the show eventually addressed it most directly, in the 300th episode called "Send in Stewie, Please," the answer it gave was characteristically evasive. We will come back to that episode. For now, let us stay with this early period and its discarded ideas, because there is one more concept from these founding years that deserves its own careful attention. The original pitch for Family Guy included elements that were substantially different from what the show became. McFarlane's vision for the show at the point of the Fox pitch was, according to accounts from people who were involved in the early development, somewhat more grounded than the final product. The cutaway gag format was present from the beginning. The character relationships were essentially in place, but the tone was pitched at a slightly different register, one in which the family's warmth was meant to be more consistently present. The early version of the show was described in development notes as a comedy about a family that loved each other despite being complete disasters, with the emphasis on the love as much as the disaster. That framing never entirely disappeared. The first 3 seasons carry it clearly. But the pitch version, the idealized version of what the show could be, was in some ways warmer and more conventionally familial than anything that made it to broadcast. There was a version of Family Guy in which Peter's foolishness was consistently balanced by genuine tenderness, in which Meg was a real character with a developing story, in which the family's chaos was rooted in love and not in cruelty. That version of Family Guy lived in documents and meetings and early story outlines. And then the show was made, and it became something slightly different, And then it evolved further, and that warm original conception became harder and harder to find in the final product. It is still there in the early episodes, if you look carefully, but it exists now as a kind of ghost, the shape of a show that was once imagined and never quite fully built. Section 4. Banned, pulled, and censored. The episodes that never reached you. Of all the categories of Lost Family Guy content, the most documented and most analyzed is the body of banned and censored material. These are not mysteries exactly. The evidence is there. The episodes exist. But they exist in a state of partial accessibility that makes them feel lost, even when they can technically be found. And the stories behind their suppression reveal a great deal about the creative pressures the show was always navigating. We have already touched on When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, but the full scope of banned and censored Family Guy material goes considerably further, and each piece of it carries a different story about why it was pulled and what that decision meant. The most absolute case of censorship in the show's entire history is an episode called the Partial Terms of Endearment. This is Season 8, Episode 21, written by staff writer Danny Smith, and it is the only episode in the show's history that was produced, completed, and then banned so comprehensively from American broadcast television that it has never aired in the United States. Not on Fox, not on Adult Swim, not in syndication. The episode can be found on the Season 8 DVD set, and it aired in other countries including the United Kingdom, but domestically it simply does not exist in the broadcast record. The story of the episode involves Lois agreeing to act as a surrogate for an old college friend and her husband. Early in the pregnancy, the biological parents are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois in the situation of carrying a child with no living parents. The central dramatic question of the episode then becomes whether to continue or terminate the pregnancy. The episode handles this with the show's characteristic tone, treating the subject through a mix of comedy and genuine weight, and it brings Peter and Lois to a real decision at the end. Fox did not ban the episode because it was poorly made. The production quality is standard for the show. Fox banned it because of the subject matter, specifically because of its treatment of abortion, which Fox's Standards and Practices team determined was too sensitive for broadcast. The network's position, as articulated at the time, was that advertisers rather than viewers were the concern. A broadcast episode dealing directly with abortion would create advertising difficulties that Fox was not willing to navigate, and so the episode was shelved, and the shelf has never been opened for American audiences. Seth MacFarlane's response to the ban was characteristically dry. He noted that the decision had been made to submit the episode for Emmy consideration, partially as a way of drawing attention to its existence and the circumstances of its suppression. As he put it, they did it to drum up Emmy votes so they could lose by fewer votes. The episode did not win any awards, but the story of its ban became one of the more discussed pieces of Family Guy history. What makes the partial terms of endearment situation particularly interesting from a Lost media perspective is that the episode exists in two versions. The DVD release and the versions that aired in other countries contain the full episode as originally produced. The American broadcast version does not exist at all because the episode was never broadcast. So for American viewers, the episode is genuinely lost in the sense that they cannot access it through any normal channel. The DVD is the only way in. The censorship of individual scenes rather than whole episodes runs even deeper through the show's history. The show maintained separate DVD and broadcast versions of many episodes throughout its run, with the DVD versions containing material that was edited or removed for television. These differences range from minor, a single line reworded, to substantial, entire scenes that change the meaning of the episode. The episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is a clear example of this. The broadcast version of the episode, when it finally aired on Fox in 2004, had been edited from the version that appeared on the DVD and on Adult Swim. One of Peter's lyrics in the I Need a Jew musical number was changed. The DVD and Adult Swim version had the line, "Hebrew people I've adored, even though they killed my Lord," which Fox replaced with, "I don't think they killed my Lord" for the broadcast version. A small change on paper, but a meaningful one in terms of how the song functions as satire. The original lyric makes the joke about Peter's confused and slightly prejudiced thinking. The altered lyric softens the edge of that. These are two slightly different episodes carrying the same title, and most people have only ever seen one of them. Then there is the Turban Cowboy situation, which represents a different category of censorship entirely. Turban Cowboy was a season 11 episode that aired in March 2013 and contained, among other things, a cutaway gag in which Peter runs over a group of people at the Boston Marathon with his car. On April 15th of that same year, the Boston Marathon bombing occurred, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. Fox immediately pulled the episode from all its platforms. Fox.com removed it. Hulu removed it. The episode effectively disappeared from the American broadcast and streaming landscape within days of a real-world tragedy that made its content impossible to air without causing pain. The difference between Turban Cowboy and the other banned episodes is context. The episode was not banned because of its content in the abstract. It was banned because real events caught up with a piece of fiction and made that fiction unbearable to show. Seth MacFarlane himself expressed regret about the cutaway gag once the bombing occurred. The episode remains largely unavailable through mainstream channels, another piece of the show that exists in a kind of limbo, findable for those who look but absent from the normal landscape. And then there are the episodes that were not formally banned, but were substantially altered between production and broadcast in ways that changed their nature. Season 2's Holy Crap, an episode about Peter's overbearing Catholic father, was produced with a significantly different ending than the one that aired. The original ending involved a confrontation between Peter's father and the Pope that Fox determined was too directly critical of Catholicism to broadcast. The episode was re-edited, and the ending changed before it went on air, with the original cut remaining unaired. The breadth of the censorship history points to something important about the show's relationship with its network over 25 years. Family Guy was always pressing against a wall, riding toward the edge of what Fox would allow, and occasionally stepping over it. The banned and censored episodes are not anomalies. They are the visible surface of a much more constant negotiation between the show's creative team and the standards and practices department. For every episode that got pulled entirely, there were dozens that were altered in smaller ways. Lines changed, scenes trimmed, cutaways tightened or removed. What the show would have looked like if every one of those changes had not been made is a version of Family Guy that exists only in the writer's original scripts and in the memories of the people who were in the room when those scripts were written. Section 5. The Unaired Production Anomalies and Strange Episodes. Beyond the formally banned episodes, there's a category of Family Guy content that occupies an even stranger space. These are the episodes and segments that were made under unusual circumstances, that deviated so far from the show's established patterns that they feel like visiting something from a parallel version of the series, and that carry with them questions about what the show was trying to do and why. The single most unusual episode ever produced for Family Guy is Brian and Stewie, the 150th episode overall, which aired on May 2nd, 2010. This episode is remarkable for one fundamental reason that sets it apart from every other episode in the show's history. There are no cutaway gags. Not one. It is the only episode in the entire run of the series without this signature element. The setup is deceptively simple. Brian and Stewie go to the bank so Brian can access his safe deposit box, and they accidentally get locked inside the vault over the weekend. There is no other location in the episode. There are no other characters. For roughly 22 minutes, it is just these two characters in a steel room talking. What happens in that room is genuinely surprising for a show whose identity was so thoroughly built around disconnected jokes and random references. The episode has the structure of a one-act play. The comedy in the first half comes from the physical circumstances, the locked vault, the limited food, and an incident involving Stewie's diaper that the show treats with its characteristic irreverence. But then the episode shifts. Brian has a gun in his safe deposit box. When Stewie asks why, Brian eventually answers honestly. He keeps it there for a specific purpose, a purpose tied to his own doubts about whether his life is worth continuing. He reveals a depth of private despair that the rest of the show, with all its cutaways and gags, had never made space for. Stewie's reaction to this revelation, the way the episode handles his understanding of what Brian has told him, is the emotional core of the piece. Without the distraction of cutaways, without the escape hatch of random jokes, the show is forced to sit with what it has said. And it sits with it in a way that feels genuinely raw. The episode was written by Gary Janetti and directed by Dominic Bianchi. Executive producer Mark Vallow described it as being like a one-act stage play, noting that it did not rely on the show's standard gag structure. Critics were divided. Some found the structural experiment genuinely moving. Others were bothered by the tonal inconsistency between the episode's more disturbing moments and the gross-out humor in the first half. But the most interesting thing about Brian and Stewie from a Lost Media perspective is not the episode itself. It is what the episode suggests about the show's potential. It proves, in 22 minutes, that Family Guy could tell an intimate, character-driven story without a single cutaway. It proves that Brian and Stewie, given room to breathe and no escape routes, could produce something that felt genuinely substantial. And then the show went right back to its normal format the following week, and the experiment was never repeated. Why was it never repeated? That is a question worth asking slowly. If the episode worked, if it demonstrated that the show had this capacity, why did that capacity stay dormant for the remaining 15 or more seasons? The answer probably has something to do with the show's identity, with what the audience expected and what Fox expected, with the business logic of a show that had found a formula that was profitable. But the result is that Brian and Stewie exist as an isolated anomaly, a single episode that showed what the show could be, and then allowed that possibility to sit unused. There are other production anomalies scattered through the show's history that deserve mention. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 is another example of the show operating in a mode that was different from its normal register. In this episode, Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the very first episode of Family Guy, the pilot, and the episode directly contrasts the present version of the characters with their earliest incarnations. It is as close as the show ever came to explicitly acknowledging that the characters had changed since the beginning, and the visual gag in the episode of the present-day Stewie and Brian watching the original series Stewie and Brian has an almost melancholy quality when you consider what those characters lost over the years. The episode Cutaway Land from Season 18 went even further in the direction of meta-commentary, building an entire episode around the premise of Peter and Lois literally traveling through the cutaway dimension. The concept had obvious potential. The show's signature tool, the randomly inserted gag, given its own physical reality and logic. But the execution disappointed many fans, particularly because the episode relied heavily on recycled cutaways from earlier seasons rather than generating new material. The meta-commentary became a vehicle for nostalgia rather than for genuinely new ideas, and it ended with Peter waking up to discover the whole experience had been a dream. One of the most exhausted storytelling endings available. What Cutaway Land accidentally revealed, in its attempt to celebrate the show's most famous element, was how much the cutaway format had become a trap rather than a tool. The episode about cutaways could not escape the problem with cutaways, which was that they had lost the element of surprise and specificity that made them funny in the first place. There is also the question of episodes that were substantially different in early production than in final broadcast. The writing process for an animated show involves multiple stages: table reads, rewrites, storyboards, animatics, and final animation, and at each stage an episode can change significantly. The Weinstein early draft was one example. But across the show's history, numerous episodes are known to have gone through dramatic changes between their initial conception and their final form. Some of these changes were made at Fox's request. Others were made internally when a story direction simply stopped working. Others were made because of real-world events that made certain jokes untenable. The result is a show where a significant portion of the comedy that was originally written for it never made it to any audience, existing only in draft scripts and the memories of the people who wrote them. Section 6. The deepest fan theories and the mysteries they are trying to solve. There is a certain kind of viewer who watches Family Guy not with the passive enjoyment of someone looking to laugh, but with the active attention of someone looking for patterns. These are the people who have watched every episode multiple times, who have noted the inconsistencies, who have mapped the moments when the show seems to contradict itself or hint at something it never fully explains. And over 25 years, this community has developed a body of theory about Family Guy that is sometimes absurd, occasionally plausible and occasionally genuinely illuminating about the show's construction. The most persistent and most discussed theory about Family Guy is one that has come to be called the Meg is a genius theory, or in some formulations, the Meg is aware theory. The premise is built around close observation of Meg Griffin across multiple seasons, and the argument that her behavior, read carefully, suggests she is far more intelligent and self-aware than the show ever explicitly acknowledges. The theory draws on several specific moments. In the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg confronts her family with a speech that is articulate, emotionally precise, and devastatingly accurate. She does not just complain, she analyzes. She explains the specific dynamics of how each family member's dysfunction contributes to the household's toxicity. She names Peter's particular failures with the specificity of someone who has been cataloging them for years. And then, in the conversation with Brian that ends the episode, she demonstrates a strategic understanding of her own family that goes far beyond what a passive victim would possess. The theory argues that Meg's acceptance of her role as the family's scapegoat is not defeat. It is a calculated choice. She has understood that the family system requires a pressure valve, someone to absorb the collective dysfunction so that everyone else can function. And she has chosen to be that person, not because she is weak, but because she has the emotional intelligence to see what no one else in the family sees clearly. In this reading, Meg is the only truly emotionally mature person in the Griffin household, and her apparent suffering is actually a kind of quiet power. This theory has never been confirmed or denied by the show's writers. It is a reading rather than an intent, but it is a reading that survives contact with the text, and in its most compelling form, it transforms the Meg storyline from something deeply uncomfortable into something almost heroic. A second major theory concerns the nature of the show's reality and whether the events of certain episodes are meant to be taken as literally happening. Family Guy has a complicated relationship with continuity. Characters die and come back. Major events are undone. Stewie's world domination plots are revealed to have been simulations. The question this raises, for fans who pay close attention, is whether there is a coherent internal logic to what is real in the Family Guy universe, or whether the show simply resets whenever narrative convenience requires it. The theory that has developed around this question proposes that Family Guy operates in what viewers might call a soft canon, where certain events are definitively real and others exist in a kind of probabilistic fog. Under this framework, the events that change the characters permanently, that leave marks carried forward into subsequent episodes, are the real ones. The events that are undone or ignored in subsequent episodes are retroactively understood to have been dreams, simulations, or alternate timeline excursions. This framework makes a certain kind of sense when applied to specific episodes. The Season 6 two-parter, in which Stewie finally kills Lois and then Lois returns and kills Stewie, ends with the revelation that the entire sequence was a simulation on Stewie's computer. The show tells you explicitly that it did not happen, but the theory asks a more interesting question, which is whether Stewie designed the simulation as a way of processing something real. Whether the events in the simulation reflect genuine desires and capabilities that exist in the, quote, real version of Stewie. The simulation argument becomes a way of understanding character motivation, even when the literal events are denied. A third theory, less generous in its construction, concerns the nature of the Griffin family's wealth. In the early seasons, the Griffin family operates clearly as a working-class household. Peter works at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory and later at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. The family has a normal-sized house, a functioning if unremarkable car, and the kind of domestic economics that suggests they are getting by without any great comfort. But across the seasons, the family's apparent wealth becomes increasingly inconsistent. They go on expensive holidays. They acquire expensive things. The brewery job, which Peter often seems to be barely employed at, produces an income that is sometimes consistent with working class and sometimes consistent with something significantly higher. The theory proposes that this inconsistency is not an accident or a sign of lazy writing, but a symptom of the show's evolving relationship with economic reality. As the show went on, the writers became less interested in grounding the characters economically and more interested in using their characters as vehicles for whatever story the episode required. The result is a family whose financial situation shifts to accommodate narrative needs, rather than existing as a consistent backdrop. And the theory argues that this shifting economic reality is one of the earliest signs of the show's loosening grip on its own internal logic. There is also the long-running theory about Brian Griffin, and whether his alcoholism was ever meant to be taken seriously as a character element, rather than just a comic trait. In the early seasons, Brian's drinking was presented with just enough weight to suggest it was more than a gag. There were moments where his relationship with alcohol seemed to carry genuine sadness, where it felt connected to his sense of failure as a writer and his unease about his place in the world. Some fans have argued that the writers originally intended to develop this into a more substantial storyline, possibly one that would have explored Brian seeking help or confronting the consequences of his drinking more directly. This never happened. The alcoholism remained a comedic trait throughout the show's run, occasionally acknowledged but never seriously examined. If there was a more developed arc planned, it disappeared in one of the show's many transitions between creative teams. And what remains is a character detail that carries the ghost of a more serious story that was never told. Section 7. The Stewie Problem. What was he really, and what happened to him? Let us slow down here and spend real time with Stewie Griffin, because Stewie is the character whose history, whose layers of creative intent and revision and contradiction, contains more genuine mystery than any other character on the show. On the surface, Stewie's story is one of the clearest character arcs in Family Guy's history. He begins as an evil genius infant determined to kill his mother and conquer the world. Over the course of several seasons, he softens. The world domination plots become less frequent. His relationship with Brian deepens. He becomes more emotional, more vulnerable, more interested in his own identity. By the time the show reaches its middle and later seasons, Stewie is essentially a different character wearing the same costume. But the surface story is not the whole story. What lies beneath it is a sequence of creative decisions, disagreements, contradictions, and abandoned intentions that make Stewie one of the most complicated figures in animated television history. Seth MacFarlane has described Stewie's early conception as being rooted in the idea of an evil Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison, the British actor perhaps best known for playing Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady, had a very particular quality. He was sophisticated, precise, slightly cruel in his elegance, and completely certain of his own superiority. MacFarlane took that quality and placed it inside an infant, and the result was Stewie Griffin. A character who spoke with the authority of someone who knew exactly how the world worked and found it deeply unsatisfactory. The early Stewie was also, according to MacFarlane's own accounts, a commentary on something real. The show's creator has said that Stewie's rage against his mother Lois was partly an exaggerated version of the helpless fury of infancy, of the experience of being completely dependent on someone for every physical need, while having no power over any aspect of your own existence. Stewie's hostility toward Lois was the extreme form of a dynamic that every parent recognizes: the infant's furious frustration at the person who controls everything. Made funny by the sophistication with which Stewie expressed it, and by the genuine danger he posed. What MacFarlane also eventually revealed in a Playboy interview was that Stewie's rage was connected to something else. His aggression, his obsessive drive to conquer and destroy, was in MacFarlane's reading a product of profound internal confusion about his own identity and orientation. The aggression was not just a character trait, it was a pressure valve for something that had no other outlet. In this interpretation, Stewie's villainy was always a symptom rather than a cause, the expression of a character trying to process something about himself through destruction rather than understanding. MacFarlane even described a specific episode that was written and taken to script phase but never produced. In this episode, Stewie was going to come out. The plot involved harassment from other children at school and Stewie traveling back in time to prevent a specific passage from the Book of Leviticus from being written. It was a high-concept, deeply strange idea that would have been the most direct statement the show had ever made about this character's interior life. The decision was made not to produce it. MacFarlane's stated reason was that ambiguity was more appropriate for a character who was, after all, 1 year old. The uncertainty, he said, gave Stewie a vulnerability that needed to be maintained. The unproduced coming out episode is one of the most fascinating pieces of Lost Family Guy content in the show's entire history. It would have been a radical departure from everything the show had done with the character. It would have been an answer to a question that the show had been deliberately leaving open for years. And it would have made Stewie's evolution from evil genius to emotionally complex character feel like something that was always building toward a specific destination rather than drifting. Instead, the question was left permanently open, and the show made a related but different choice. Rather than explicitly addressing Stewie's sexuality, it began accumulating evidence around it, one gag at a time. Cross-dressing jokes, references to attractions, dreams and fantasies that pointed in particular directions. The show built a case over 15 years of television without ever delivering a verdict, and in doing so, it made the question more interesting and also more frustrating, depending on your perspective. The 300th episode, Send In Stewie Please, came the closest the show ever came to directly addressing all of this. In this episode, Stewie is sent to see a school psychologist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, voiced by Sir Ian McKellen. In a therapy session, the question of Stewie's sexuality comes up. The episode's writer, Gary Janetti, later told reporters that the creative team had discussed the issue extensively with MacFarlane, and that MacFarlane's position was not to lean into it too much. The episode left the question open in a way that was clearly deliberate. Janetti's quote was memorable. Stewie isn't even sure that heterosexual is a real word. The episode also addressed the accent question. Stewie's refined British accent, a central feature of his character from the beginning, is heard in the episode only by Dr. Pritchfield, while other characters hear what appears to be a more ordinary voice. The implication is that the accent, along with the sophisticated vocabulary and the elaborate persona, is something Stewie performs for his own benefit rather than a neutral property of his speech. It is a mask as much as a voice. And the episode suggests that underneath the mask is something much more uncertain and much more vulnerable than the self-possessed Bond villain of the early seasons ever showed. This revelation, if taken seriously, retroactively changes the entire character. If the early Stewie's confident villainy was itself a performance, a mask worn by someone who had no other way to process their confusion about who they were, then the slow dismantling of the evil genius persona over the show's middle seasons was not the writers abandoning the character. It was the character's mask slowly slipping. The real Stewie, whoever that is, has always been underneath, and the evil genius was never the truth of him. This is a beautiful interpretation. It gives the character's evolution a coherence it sometimes lacks when viewed from the outside. But it is also an interpretation that the show itself never fully committed to. The writers seemed aware of it, seemed to sometimes be building toward it, and then backed away from the implications before they became too definitive. What was left was something rich and unresolved, a character whose genuine nature remained one of the show's longest-running mysteries. There is one more dimension of Stewie's story that deserves attention, and it connects back to the lost media angle. The Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie was explicitly framed as the culmination of everything the early character had been building toward. Stewie finally does it. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always said he would be. For 2 episodes, the show followed that premise to its conclusion and let Stewie have his victory. And then the twist came, and it was all a simulation, and the show reset. The creative team has never fully explained why they chose that ending. The simulation twist was clever, but it was also a way of having everything and nothing at once. Stewie could achieve his goals without the show having to live with the consequences of those achievements. The two-parter was described by some writers as a goodbye to the evil Stewie, an acknowledgement that this version of the character had been taken as far as he could go. But in choosing to say goodbye through a simulation rather than a real event, the show denied its own history the weight it deserved. What remained after the simulation was revealed was a character who had lost his purpose without being given a clearly defined replacement. The new Stewie, the emotional and vulnerable one, is genuinely interesting in his own right. But he exists in the shadow of the character he used to be, and the gap between those two versions of Stewie Griffin contains some of the most unresolved creative questions in the show's entire history. Section 8. Brian Griffin's Secrets, The Layers Beneath the Talking Dog to Dubai. If Stewie's mystery is about what he really is and what he really wants, Brian Griffin's mystery is about what he was always afraid of and whether the show ever truly understood him. Brian is introduced as the smartest member of the Griffin family. He is cultured, articulate, and dryly funny in the way that only someone who has read a great many books and found most of them disappointingly inadequate can be. He drives a Prius. He drinks martinis. He has a novel in progress, has had it in progress for years, and never finishes it. He loves Lois in a way he mostly keeps to himself. He is Peter's best friend despite being his intellectual opposite, and their friendship works precisely because of that opposition. Brian sees what Peter cannot, and Peter does something that Brian never quite manages, which is to simply live in the world without analyzing it to pieces. In the early seasons, Brian's depth was constructed through accumulation. Each episode added a small detail: his unrequited feeling for Lois, his complicated relationship with the novel that was supposed to prove he was a serious writer, his tendency toward alcohol when things were not going well, his genuine affection for Stewie, built slowly over the show's first 3 seasons, from a wary professional tolerance to something that started to look like real friendship. These details never overwhelmed the comedy. They existed underneath it, giving the character a quality of genuine feeling that made him feel like a person rather than a cartoon. What is particularly interesting about the early Brian, from a lost media and production history perspective, is the question of how much of his interior life was intentionally constructed and how much emerged organically from the writing. McFarlane has said in various interviews that Brian was partly autobiographical, that the character's frustrations with his creative life, his sense of having intelligence without a clear outlet for it, reflected something of his own experience as a young writer, working at Hanna-Barbera on shows that were below his ambition. The failed novel was not just a running gag, it was a symbol of something specific. This autobiographical dimension makes certain choices about what was written for Brian and what was cut or altered more significant. There were early scripts that explored Brian's past more directly, that gave him a backstory before the Griffin family, that would have added specific dimensions to who he was and why he behaved as he did. Some of these backstory elements made it to air. We learned over time that Brian had a son he largely ignored, that he had been through relationships that damaged him, that he had a deep fear of dying that he processed by keeping a very specific item in a very specific location. But other elements of Brian's history were written and then set aside. His relationship with his mother was explored in one early episode that revealed she had been a complicated and painful presence in his life, but this thread was rarely returned to. His relationship with his own identity as a date rather than a person was occasionally raised as a question and then dropped. The show knew that Brian's nature was a source of potential depth, but was not always willing to go there. The Brian and Stewie episode remains the clearest window into the version of Brian that the show could have built, if it had been willing to hold still long enough. In that episode, in the confines of a vault with nowhere else to go, Brian tells Stewie about the gun in the safe deposit box. He explains, without quite explaining in full detail, that he keeps it there because he does not always trust himself without it being there. Because there are times when the weight of everything becomes heavy enough that he wants to know there is an option. This is handled with care in the episode. The show does not romanticize what Brian is describing. Stewie's reaction is alarm, not fascination. And the emotional core of what follows, as Stewie processes what his best friend has told him, is about connection and care rather than about the darkness itself. The episode is ultimately about what Stewie means to Brian, how the relationship between them, bizarre and improbable as it is, provides Brian with a reason that he might not otherwise have. This element of Brian's character, this private struggle with the weight of his own existence, is the most genuinely lost piece of his story. It appears once in one episode, and then is never returned to in any serious way. The show goes back to Brian being pretentious and occasionally insufferable and chasing women and arguing about politics, and the depth that was briefly visible closes over again like water filling a hole. What would the show have looked like if it had followed that thread? If Brian's private struggles had been developed as a consistent undercurrent rather than a single isolated disclosure? That version of the show would have required writers who were willing to sit with darkness and do something meaningful with it, which was not always the kind of writers who were in the room. But the potential was there, demonstrated in 22 minutes of television that proved the show was capable of it. Brian's early relationship with Lois is another element that carries the feeling of something that was started and then abandoned. In the first 3 seasons, his feelings for Lois were a recurring subtle presence. Not played for laughs in the way they would later be, not treated as a gag. They were presented as a genuine ache, something Brian lived with quietly in the way that people live with feelings that have no place to go. There were early indications that the writers intended this to develop into a more substantial storyline. Certain episodes in the first and second seasons contain moments where the camera holds on Brian watching Lois in a way that feels deliberate, that feels like the visual grammar of a show building toward something. What that something was, whether it was a confrontation, a moment of genuine connection, or a deepening of the complicated triangle between Brian, Peter, and Lois, is not entirely clear from what survived. What is clear is that the storyline was effectively abandoned after the revival seasons. By season 4 and 5, Brian's feelings for Lois were a running joke rather than a source of dramatic potential. The complexity was replaced with comedy, and the comedy was more broadly played than the subtlety that had been there before. The Brian question is ultimately this: was the show always planning to make him insufferable, or did it understand what it had and choose to walk away from it? The evidence of the early seasons suggests genuine creative investment. The evidence of the later seasons suggests that investment was traded for something easier. And what was lost in that trade is one of the more significant, unclaimed promises in Family Guy's long history. Section 9. Meg's true arc. The character the show never let breathe. There is a version of Family Guy where Meg Griffin is one of the most interesting characters on television, where the ordinary teenager navigating an extraordinary and chaotic family becomes a lens through which the show examines what normal means, what it costs to be the unspecial one, what it feels like to want love from people who are too wrapped up in their own chaos to notice you clearly. That version of Family Guy flickers into existence occasionally, and then it is extinguished. Meg Griffin was voiced in the very first season by actress Lacey Chabert. From season 2 onward, Mila Kunis took the role, and her version of Meg has defined the character for almost the entire show's run. Kunis has done extraordinary work with material that frequently asked nothing of her beyond functioning as a punchline. When the material gave her something real to work with, she delivered it with a consistency and emotional honesty that made the contrast with the show's general treatment of the character all the more striking. The early Meg was never going to be the show's most exciting character. That was essentially built into her design. In a family that included an evil baby, a talking dog, and a spectacularly dim-witted father, the ordinary teenager was always going to be the quietest note. But quiet was not the same as uninteresting, and the first 3 seasons used Meg's ordinariness with some real intelligence. Her storylines in those early seasons were about the specific kind of invisibility that comes from being surrounded by louder, stranger, more demanding presences. Her social struggles at school were grounded in the kind of low-level social pain that a lot of people watching recognized from their own experience. The joke was not cruelty, it was recognition. What happened after the revival is documented, and the details are painful enough that we do not need to linger on every specific incident here. The abuse of Meg escalated over roughly a decade from mildly insensitive jokes about her unpopularity to something that was hard to watch without discomfort. Physical harm played for comedy, parents joking about having tried to abandon her as an infant, a family united in contempt for one of its own members, in ways that went far beyond the gentle mockery of the early years. But what is specifically lost in the context of this discussion are the moments where the show reached towards something better and then stepped back. The most significant of these is the episode Peter's Sister from season 14. This episode did something that the show had been avoiding for years. It gave the abuse of Meg a specific origin and a specific emotional logic. The episode reveals that Peter's own sister had bullied and abused him throughout his childhood, and that the way Peter treats Meg is a learned behavior rooted in his own history of being treated that way. The cycle of abuse passed down through a family that never learned to process its own pain is given a clear shape. What makes this episode genuinely moving is that it then does something with that revelation. Meg learns about what happened to Peter. She does not simply forgive him, but she develops a compassion for him that changes the dynamic between them. They have a moment of real connection, a moment where two people who have been hurting each other recognize the shared pain underneath the conflict. And then the next episode reset everything. The emotional work of Peter's sister did not carry forward. The characters returned to their established dynamic as if the reconciliation had not happened. The cycle that was acknowledged and broken in one episode was quietly reinstated in the next. For viewers who had been waiting for Meg to receive some genuine recognition, the pattern was deeply frustrating. There are scattered episodes across the later seasons where Meg is treated as a fully realized character. The Simpsons crossover episode from season 13, in which Meg meets Lisa Simpson and the two of them become genuine friends, is often cited as an example. Lisa recognizes Meg's worth in the way that the show itself rarely does. She encourages her, discovers her talent for saxophone, and treats her as someone who matters. The episode functions almost as a corrective to years of abuse, a version of Meg rendered through the eyes of another show's values rather than her own show's habits. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode, the deeply controversial season 10 episode that had Meg confront her family and then accept her role as scapegoat, is the most debated episode in Meg's storyline for the specific reason that it showed the show was aware of what it was doing. The episode acknowledged explicitly that the family needed Meg as a punching bag. It articulated the dynamic directly, and then it had Meg choose to re-enter that dynamic willingly. For some viewers, this was a statement about the tragedy of certain family roles, about the way people can be conditioned to accept abuse as their function. For many others, it was unacceptable. The message read as advocacy for accepting mistreatment, as a show telling its most put-upon character that her suffering was necessary and appropriate. What was the intended message? The writers, when pressed, have given answers that are not entirely satisfying. The episode's tone suggests something meant to be bittersweet rather than simply dark, but tone alone cannot carry the full weight of what the episode communicated, and the gap between intent and effect is one of the most uncomfortable in the show's history. What was genuinely lost across all of this was the Meg Griffin the show was capable of writing. Every episode where she was given real material demonstrated this. She was consistently, in those episodes, one of the most sympathetic and human characters in the show's world. Not because she was perfect or interesting in conventional television ways, but because she wanted ordinary things that the show consistently denied her. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be loved without conditions attached. She wanted her family to choose her over and over, the way she always chose them. That Meg, the one who deserved that story, appears in fragments throughout the show's run. She exists in the spaces between the cruel jokes. She is visible in the moments when the writers chose her rather than the punchline she had been reduced to. And those moments, scattered across 25 years of television, constitute a character whose full story was never told and probably never will be. Section 10. The multiverse episodes, dream sequences, and the question of what is real Family Guy has, over its long run, developed what might be called a complicated relationship with reality. The show's use of alternate universes, dream sequences, simulations, time travel, and what-if scenarios has been so extensive and so inconsistently applied that the question of what is actually happening in the, quote, real version of this show becomes genuinely interesting. This is not purely an academic question. It matters for how you understand the characters and their histories. If certain major events were simulations or dreams, what does that mean for how those events revealed character? If time travel can undo deaths and decisions, what weight do those deaths and decisions carry? And if the show has been inconsistent about what counts as real, does that inconsistency tell us something about how it understood its own world? The Road to the Multiverse episode, the Season 8 premiere, is the most explicit exploration of these questions the show ever produced. Stewie has built a device that allows him and Brian to jump between alternate universes, and the episode uses this premise to visit versions of the Family Guy world rendered in different animation styles and governed by different physical laws. There is a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are pets. There is a universe that looks like a Disney animated film from the 1940s, soft and musical and deeply strange when applied to the Griffin characters. There is a robot chicken universe rendered in stop motion, where everything has a slightly different weight and movement. There is a version of the world where Christianity never took hold and the Roman Empire never fell, which is drawn as a technologically advanced society of toga-wearing sophisticates. Each alternate universe in Road to the Multiverse is a commentary as much as a comedy. The Disney universe is funny, partly because the Griffin family's chaos fits so poorly into the warmth and softness of the visual style. The dog-dominant universe is funny because Brian, liberated from his role as the family pet, becomes something both freer and more complicated. The episode uses the multiverse format to ask what these characters would be if the variables around them were different. And the answers it arrives at are consistently illuminating. But the episode also does something more unsettling. By the end, the device that allowed the travel between universes is broken, and Stewie and Brian are left in a universe adjacent to but different from their original one. The episode acknowledges that returning to exactly the right universe, the quote real one, may not be possible. The final moments have a dark undertone. They are back in something that looks like home but might not be exactly home. This is played as a resolution rather than a horror, because the show was not interested in pursuing the darker implications of what it had described. But those implications are there. Every subsequent episode of Family Guy after Road to the Multiverse could theoretically take place in a slightly wrong universe, a version of the show's world that is close to the original but not quite identical. Some fans have found this genuinely haunting, not in a supernatural way, but in the way that the show's increasing inconsistency about character and history started to feel less like lazy writing and more like the natural result of existing in a world where the rules kept shifting. The time travel episodes add another dimension to this question. Stewie's time machine is used repeatedly across the show's middle and later seasons, and its use creates a timeline that is genuinely impossible to fully reconcile. Events are changed and then restored. People die and come back. The killing of a character in Season 12 was undone 2 episodes later, with Stewie using the time machine to prevent it. The emotional impact of the death, which had generated enormous fan reaction and media coverage, was effectively cancelled. The show had its drama and then took it back. What does it mean for the show's world that time can be undone this easily? It means, in a practical sense, that consequences are optional, that any major event can be reversed if the show decides the reversal is convenient. And that knowledge drains the weight from future events, because viewers who have watched long enough have learned that nothing needs to be permanent. The dream sequence episodes work on a similar principle. When an episode turns out to have been a dream, the events within it are stripped of narrative consequence. They can be used for comedy or emotional effect, but they do not have to connect to anything outside themselves. The show uses this format extensively, and the repeated use of it creates a specific relationship between the audience and the story. A relationship built on the expectation that nothing has to mean anything unless the show decides it does. There is a fan theory built around all of this that proposes the following. The real Family Guy universe, the consistent one, the one where all the events that have lasting consequences actually occurred, is smaller than it appears. It is made up of a specific subset of episodes, the ones that are never undone or retconned or revealed to have been dreams. Everything else, the simulations, the dreams, the time travel reversals, the what-if episodes, exist in a parallel space that informs our understanding of the characters without technically being part of the main story. This theory is unprovable. The show has never provided a consistent enough framework to either confirm or deny it. But the act of trying to construct such a theory, of trying to identify what is real in this world, tells you something important about what the show became over time. It became a place where the line between what happened and what was imagined was so blurry that the question of which was which stopped having a clear answer. The early Family Guy had no such problem. In the first 3 seasons, events happened and had consequences. They were funny and sometimes absurd, but they were real within the world of the show. The introduction of Stewie's time machine in Season 4 was the beginning of a shift, one that gradually transformed the show from a place with a defined reality into something more like a space where stories could be generated without any obligation to each other. That shift was a creative choice, and like many of the creative choices we have examined tonight, it produced both gain and loss. The gain was freedom. The ability to tell any kind of story in any kind of register without worrying about how it fit into the whole. The loss was coherence, the sense of a world with consistent rules and the characters who lived by them. Section 11. The strange mysteries that were never explained. Beyond the lost episodes and the character questions and the production history, there is a category of Family Guy mystery that is subtler and stranger. These are the elements of the show that exist in every viewer's memory as unresolved textures, things that were introduced and never explained, patterns that seem deliberate but were never acknowledged, moments that feel like they were building towards something that never arrived. One of the most persistent of these is the question of Stewie's changing abilities. In the early seasons, Stewie built weapons of genuinely impressive sophistication. Ray guns, mind control devices, weather machines. The complexity and effectiveness of these inventions was presented as real. They worked. They had consequences within the world of the show. Stewie was dangerous in a literal sense that went beyond the comedy of his ambition. But the nature of his abilities was never explained. How does a 1-year-old build a working laser cannon in a nursery bedroom? Where does he get the materials? How does he acquire the technical knowledge required? The show never addressed these questions, which was fine in the early seasons when the central joke was the contrast between Stewie's infant appearance and his adult capability. But as the show went on and Stewie's character shifted away from villainy, the question of where his abilities came from became more interesting and more unanswered. There was an early suggestion, in a few season 1 and 2 moments, that Stewie's intelligence might be connected to something specific about his birth or his genetics. The shape of his head, unusual in the Griffin family, was addressed in a single flashback that attributed it to an accident during infancy. But some fans have always read the football-shaped head as a visual indicator of something genuinely different about Stewie's biology, something that might explain his extraordinary cognitive development. This was never developed. The head shape became a visual joke rather than a narrative detail, and the question of what makes Stewie Stewie was left to accumulate without a clear answer. There is also the long-standing question about Brian's past and specifically about the years before he joined the Griffin family. We are given fragments over the course of the show. He was adopted by the Griffins. He grew up with them. He had experiences before them, brief references to a life outside the family home that are mentioned, and then not returned to. There is an early episode that explores Brian's relationship with his biological mother, who had been given away and ended up living a difficult life, and the episode used this to add specific pain to Brian's sense of his own origins. But the full picture of who Brian was before the Griffins was never assembled. The question that sits underneath all of this is whether Brian's human-level intelligence, his ability to speak and reason and form complex social relationships, was ever meant to be explained. The show presented it as simply a given from the beginning. Brian talks because Brian talks. But in a world where this extraordinary fact is never examined, where nobody outside the Griffin circle seems to find it unusual, the silence around it starts to feel like a deliberate withholding rather than an oversight. The character of Mayor Adam West, voiced by the late Adam West himself, represents a different kind of unexplained mystery. West played a version of himself as the mayor of the Griffin's town, and the character was built around a specific kind of absurdist, non-sequitur humor, where the mayor's responses to every situation were completely disconnected from reality. He would pursue ridiculous obsessions with complete conviction, respond to crises with unrelated observations, and behave as though the laws of cause and effect did not apply to his perceptions. The show never explained why the mayor was this way. It was simply a given. But the consistency of his behavior, the specific flavor of his unreality, created the impression of a character with an interior logic that the writers understood but never shared with the audience. The mayor always felt like the visible part of something larger, a joke with implications that were never unpacked. Adam West passed away in June of 2017, and the show addressed his death in a season 16 episode called Adam West High, in which the town renamed the local school in his honor. The episode was a genuine tribute, using the character's specific brand of surreal conviction to say goodbye in the only language he ever spoke. It was one of the most affectionate things the show had done in years, and it closed the mayor's story without ever explaining it. The Quagmire evolution is another unexplained progression in the show's history. Glenn Quagmire was introduced as a fairly one-note character, the neighbor whose defining trait was his sexual appetite, played for laughs with the show's characteristic lack of consequences. As the show went on, Quagmire evolved in ways that were never fully explained or explored. He became capable of genuine anger, as in the famous Season 8 speech in which he confronted Brian about his hypocrisy. He showed depth in an episode addressing his father's gender transition, handling the material with more honesty than the show usually brought to sensitive subjects. He demonstrated loyalty and genuine feeling in moments that went beyond his original comedic function. But the evolution was never framed as an arc. Quagmire did not become a more complex character through a clear developmental process. He became more complex in specific episodes and then reverted in others. His growth was inconsistent in the way that all the characters' growth was inconsistent, dependent on who was writing the episode rather than on any through line that governed the character across seasons. This inconsistency is itself one of Family Guy's deepest mysteries. How do you explain a show that could, in one episode, produce something as emotionally coherent as Brian and Stewie, and in the next episode produce something as apparently thoughtless as the worst of the later Meg abuse? The same writing room, often the same season, producing things of wildly different quality and intent. The answer probably involves the reality of how television is made, with different writers assigned different episodes, different levels of creative oversight at different times, and no single voice responsible for maintaining coherence across all of it. But the result, experienced by the audience, is a show whose mysteries accumulate not only in its unaired content, but in its aired content, in the episodes that exist and contradict each other, in the character moments that open questions and then abandon them, in the world that was built piece by piece without ever being fully mapped. Section 12. The legacy, the what-ifs, and the quiet mysteries that remain. It is late now, or early, depending on how you measure it. The kind of hour when everything seems both very clear and very distant at the same time. Family Guy has been part of the television landscape for over 25 years. Its first episode aired to 22 million people on the night of a Super Bowl. Its recent seasons air to fewer than a million. The distance between those two numbers tells you something about what happened to the show over time. But the distance is not the whole story, because the show that reaches smaller audiences today still casts an enormous shadow over the history of animated comedy. The show was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones, almost 50 years earlier. In 2013, TV Guide ranked it among the 9 greatest animated series in television history. These are not the achievements of a show that was ever simply trash. They are the achievements of a show that was, at its best, doing something genuinely extraordinary, something that television had not seen before and has not quite seen since. What is truly lost in the Family Guy story is not just the banned episodes or the unproduced scripts. What is lost is the version of the show that was possible but never fully built. The show that the early seasons pointed toward, that could have followed its best impulses across 25 years instead of its most convenient ones. The Meg who was never given her real arc. The Brian who could have been the most nuanced character on television. The Stewie who might have been given an answer rather than a permanent question. The Peter who stayed lovable rather than becoming something else. These are not just nostalgia. They are genuine possibilities that existed in the material. The evidence is there in the episodes that worked, in the moments that showed what was possible when the writers chose depth over ease. The show was not incapable of being great throughout its entire run. It was great periodically in specific episodes, when specific people were paying close enough attention. And then it returned to its default settings, and the potential folded back in on itself. There are things about Family Guy that will probably never be explained. The full extent of what was planned for the early Stewie and why those plans were changed. The complete picture of what the 2 cancellations destroyed in terms of story arcs that were in development. The specific reasons certain scenes and episodes were altered or banned that go beyond what the official accounts have offered. The interior life that Brian carried through the early seasons. The carefully constructed sadness of a character who knew exactly what he was and found it quietly insufficient. And there are things that existed once in some form and no longer do. Scripts that were written and rewritten until the original version was gone. Animation that was drawn and then discarded when the episode was redesigned. Story meetings where someone proposed something that would have changed the show's direction and was outvoted. Ideas that made it as far as a table read and were then never spoken of again. The lost media community continues to look for these things. The found early draft designation on the Lost Media wiki entry for the original Weinstein script, uploaded in July of 2025, shows that this work continues and that material does still emerge. There will be more. Somewhere in archival storage at Fox or in the private collections of people who worked on the show are more pieces of what Family Guy could have been. More fragments of the show that was imagined before the show that was made. What do we do with these lost things when we find them? Sometimes we simply know about them. We add them to our understanding of the show's history and let them shift the way we see the whole. The knowledge that there was a version of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein before the one that aired, that the original script was substantially different enough to require a full rewrite, changes how you think about the episode even if you have never read the original. It makes the aired version feel like a compromise, a negotiation between what was first imagined and what was eventually allowed. All of television is this way, to some degree. Every show is a series of compromises between what was first imagined and what was finally made. But Family Guy's specific history, its double cancellations, its network tensions, its creators' partial withdrawal, its long run through multiple writing generations, makes those compromises more visible and more consequential than in most other shows. The Stewie spinoff announced in 2024 suggests that the character still has creative life in him. The show was renewed through season 27. New episodes are being made. The story is not over. But the version of the story that most haunts anyone who loves this show is not the future one. It is the earlier one. The version where the first cancellation never happened and the writing team stayed together. Where Meg was given the arc she deserved from the beginning. Where Brian's private struggles were developed into something substantial. Where Stewie's unproduced coming out episode was made and released to the world. Those versions are quiet now. They exist in the part of the imagination where things that could have been live alongside things that were. And in the specific hour of the night when the screens are dim and the voices of these characters drift softly through the dark. That quiet space between what was and what might have been is exactly where the mind goes. The mysteries of Family Guy are not going away. They will accumulate along with the episodes, season after season, as long as the show keeps running. And the people who care enough to look for the lost pieces, to watch carefully, to ask what else was in those rooms, will keep finding fragments of a story that is larger and stranger and more deeply felt than anything that ever officially aired. Sleep well. If you drift off here, you are drifting off somewhere good. Somewhere familiar and a little strange, which is exactly what this show has always been. If this kind of careful, quiet exploration is something you want more of, a like and a subscription would mean a great deal. Drop a comment down below with where you are and what time it is. This community, the one built in the quiet hours, is one of the genuinely good things about spending time on the internet. Thank you for being part of it. End of script. Supplementary section, production details, and additional mysteries for extended narration. This section exists to extend the script further and provide additional rich material that can be drawn from for extended recordings or further narration. The animation studios and the changing look of the show, one dimension of Family Guy's history that receives less attention than it deserves, is the way the show's visual character shifted across its run in connection with the different animation studios that produced it. These are not trivial differences. Animation style in a comedy affects how jokes land, how expressions read, and how the whole emotional texture of a show feels to the viewer. The original 3 seasons were handled by Rough Draft Studios in Seoul, South Korea, one of the most respected animation production houses in the industry. Rough Draft had done work for The Simpsons, and would later work on Futurama, and their involvement brought a specific quality to the early Family Guy episodes that fans who have watched closely can identify. The character movements in the Rough Draft seasons have a looseness to them, a physical generosity that makes the comedy feel alive in a particular way. When Peter falls down a flight of stairs in the Rough Draft episodes, the fall has a specific weight and rhythm that makes it funnier than the same fall rendered more stiffly would be. When the show returned from cancellation in 2005, the animation work was handled differently, and the visual quality changed in ways that were immediately noticeable to attentive viewers. The outlines became thicker and more uniform. The character movements became more restricted. The expressiveness of the animation diminished somewhat. Not enough to ruin the show, but enough to change how it felt. By the time the show reached seasons 6 and 7, different studios were handling different portions of the production, including a studio called Digital Emation, which brought yet another visual approach to the character rendering. The show's appearance became inconsistent across seasons in a way that mirrors and in some ways reflects its tonal inconsistency. This is a lost dimension of the show that most casual viewers never consciously register, but that informs their experience in real ways. The Family Guy of Season 2 and The Family Guy of Season 12 are not just tonally different, they are physically different, rendered by different hands with different sensibilities. The original show has a warmth in its animation that went away along with the warmth in its writing, and the two losses reinforced each other. The Conway-Twitty question. There is a running element of the later seasons that deserves its own examination. The Conway-Twitty cutaway gag, in which the show simply cut to a full, unedited performance of the country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs with no punchline and no resolution, appeared multiple times in the show's middle seasons. It was the ultimate statement of cutaway dependency, a cutaway that made no comedic argument at all, that simply occupied time and dared the audience to keep watching. The mystery of the Conway-Twitty gag is whether it was meant to be funny in a meta sense, a joke about the show's own laziness, or whether it was genuinely a case of writers filling time when they had nothing better. The show's own self-awareness about its weaknesses, which it demonstrated repeatedly through fourth-wall breaking jokes and meta-commentary, makes it possible to read the Conway-Twitty segments as deliberately satirical. But the problem with that reading is that even satire needs to be executed with enough care to land, and the Conway-Twitty gags were not executed with care. They were just there. Conway-Twitty passed away in 1993, 6 years before Family Guy premiered. The use of his footage was a choice to use archive material, a real person's real recorded performances, as the substance of a joke that had no clear point. Whether the joke was at Twitty's expense, or at the audience's expense, or at the show's own expense was never made clear. And the ambiguity reads less as clever in joke and more as creative exhaustion, wearing the costume of irony. The Conway-Twitty gag became one of the most cited examples of what fans felt had gone wrong with the show's comedy in its later years. The joke that had originally worked through surprise the first time it was unexpected enough to be funny in its sheer absurdity, became through repetition a symbol of a show that had run out of ways to surprise its audience and had decided to simply stop trying. The question of what the show actually thinks about itself. There is a specific kind of late-period Family Guy episode that deserves attention as a category unto itself. These are the episodes in which the show explicitly comments on its own quality, its own decline, its own long run as comedy. Peter will break the fourth wall to acknowledge that the episode is not very good. Characters will reference the show's declining ratings. Cutaway gags will include jokes about the writers whilst running out of ideas. This self-awareness is interesting from a creative perspective because it demonstrates that the people making the show knew what the critics were saying. They had read the reviews, they had heard the fan complaints. They understood the argument that the show had lost something, and their response was to fold that knowledge back into the comedy, to make jokes about the problems rather than addressing them. Some viewers found this charming. A show secure enough in its own identity to mock its own weaknesses is doing something that requires a certain kind of confidence. But others found it the opposite of reassuring. Acknowledging a problem in a joke is not the same as solving it. A comedy show that jokes about its own creative exhaustion is not thereby proving it is not exhausted. The self-awareness becomes a way of insulating the show from criticism without actually changing anything. This is perhaps the deepest mystery of Family Guy's later period. How did a show that clearly understood its own weaknesses continue to reproduce those weaknesses episode after episode? How did the people in the room, who knew that cutaways had become a crutch, keep using them as a crutch? How did the writers who understood that the characters had lost their depth continue to write shallow versions of those characters? The answer involves the complexity of institutional inertia, of the business logic that keeps a profitable show running regardless of creative quality, of the difficulty of changing the habits of a production machine that had been built to produce a specific kind of content efficiently. But it also involves something more personal, something about the comfort of familiar patterns and the difficulty of choosing difficulty when ease is available. The Family Guy that might have kept asking hard questions of itself, the one that might have made Brian and Stewie the template rather than the anomaly, required more than self-awareness. It required the willingness to let that self-awareness change what the show actually did. That willingness was never consistently present, and its absence is the final and perhaps most significant lost thing in this whole long story. The broader world of connected media. Family Guy's lost history does not exist only within the show itself. There is a connected ecosystem of games, specials, and spin-off content that carries its own fragmentary quality. The direct-to-video special, Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story, from 2005 was originally conceived as a series of linked episodes, but was released as a feature. It contained material that was more adult in tone than what could air on broadcast television, and took certain character elements in directions the weekly series was not willing to sustain. Stewie's future self in this special was depicted as a neurotic, hyperverbal personality whose arc through the movie involved coming to terms with his own nature in ways the show's regular episodes avoided. The Family Guy online game, which ran from 2012 to 2013, contained original content created specifically for the game that does not exist anywhere else. Character dialogue, original cutaway concepts, and story scenarios that were written for the game and never transferred to any other medium now exist only in the memory of the people who played it during its brief operation. The game shut down after about a year, and its content is essentially gone. The unrealized projects connected to the show are equally interesting. There have been various reports over the years of feature film concepts that were developed and then set aside. A Family Guy theatrical film was discussed at multiple points in the show's history, with different creative approaches at different times. None of these progressed to production. The version of the show that might have made it to cinema remains entirely hypothetical. There was also the ongoing question, across many seasons, of whether certain plots hinted at in the main series would be resolved in a spin-off or special. The character of Brian's son Dylan, introduced in a season 6 episode as a teenage boy Brian fathered with a woman he once dated, was positioned in that episode as a potential recurring character. He appeared in a few subsequent episodes and then effectively disappeared from the show's world without a clear resolution to his storyline. What happened to Dylan is one of those small, quiet mysteries that the show accumulated without ever answering. The final mystery. Why do we keep watching? There is one last question that runs underneath everything we have discussed tonight, and it is the most human question of all. Why do people keep watching? Not why do they watch the show generally. That is easy to explain. The show is accessible and funny and in its best moments genuinely inspired, and it is everywhere available on streaming platforms and in reruns, and in the cultural memory of a generation that grew up with it. But why do the people who have noticed all of this, who are aware of the character decline and the cutaway overload and the treatment of Meg and the loss of early Stewie's brilliance, why do they keep coming back? The answer has something to do with the strange loyalty that early seasons can create. A show that was once genuinely great has a claim on you that a show which was always mediocre does not. You keep watching because you remember what it was. Because you know from specific episodes that the characters are capable of something more than what the recent episodes have asked of them. Because the voice of Stewie or the dynamic between Brian and Peter carries a specific comfort that belongs to a much earlier time in your own life, as well as the show's. You keep watching the same way you might return to a place you loved when you were younger and find it changed. Not to feel the change, but to feel the echo of what was there before. The dissonance between what it is and what you remember does not cancel the comfort. Sometimes it adds to it. The knowledge of what was lost makes the fragments that remain feel more precious. Family Guy is, at its core, a show about a family that keeps choosing each other despite everything. Despite the chaos and the cruelty and the failures. Despite the reset buttons and the unresolved arcs. Despite all the things that should, by rational account, drive them apart. The Griffin family stays together. Episode after episode, season after season, they are still there in the house, around the table, on the couch, watching television. The family that was lovable in the early years and sometimes difficult to love in the later ones, but always there. Always somehow continuing. There is a mystery in that too. A small, quiet one. Why does this particular family, of all the fictional families that television has created and discarded, feel so persistent? Why does the show keep going? Maybe the answer is the same as the one for why people keep watching. Because the early episodes built something real enough that it could not be entirely undone by everything that came after. Because the foundations of the show, the characters in their original forms, the warmth that held the early seasons together, left a mark deep enough to outlast the drift. Because somewhere in the show that airs today, underneath all the changes, the original Griffin family is still there, quieter than they used to be, harder to find, but present. And on a night like this one, when the room is still and the only sound is the soft voice carrying these stories through the dark, that presence is enough. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Thank you for your time and your attention. If you enjoyed this, a like and a subscription are always appreciated. They genuinely make a difference and help keep this kind of content coming. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it is. This community is one of the best things about making these videos, and knowing you are out there, listening in the quiet, makes all of it worthwhile. Extended Section A. The road to episodes and the show within the show. One of the quieter but most consistent threads running through Family Guy's entire history is a series of special episodes that managed to maintain a quality of character and storytelling that was largely absent from the regular format. These are the Road to Episodes, so named after the old Bing Crosby and Bob Hope comedy films from the 1940s. A series of musical travel adventures in which the two leads got lost in exotic locations and relied on each other's completely different skills to survive. The Family Guy Road to Episodes took that same basic structure, put Brian and Stewie in the lead roles, and produced something that often felt like a separate and considerably better show than the one surrounding it. The Road to series began modestly enough in Season 2 with an episode called Road to Rhode Island, which sent Stewie on a solo journey to retrieve Brian from his biological mother's home in Texas after Brian's plans to attend a conference there went sideways. What made that episode work was not just the comedy of Stewie and Brian on the road together, though that was genuinely funny. What made it work was the unexpected emotional weight of Brian's visit to his biological family. The episode revealed that Brian had been separated from his mother as a puppy, and that she had not had an easy life. The moment Brian encountered what had become of her was handled with a gentleness that the show did not always possess, and it added specific biographical weight to a character who had until that point been defined primarily through his intellectual pretensions and his role as Peter's voice of reason. Road to Europe, the Season 3 entry, pushed further in developing the Stewie and Brian dynamic by stranding them in Saudi Arabia and sending them on a musical journey across Europe toward home. The episode contained one of the most genuinely beautiful musical moments the show produced. A quiet piece that the two characters shared while watching the sun rise over a landscape that had nothing to do with the world they usually inhabited. The show was willing in this episode to let its two most verbally sophisticated characters simply be in a moment together, without gags, without cutaways, without the machinery of the show's usual format. It worked in a way that was almost surprising coming from a show that generally did not trust its audience to sit with something quiet. Road to Rupert, the Season 5 entry, addressed something that had been sitting in the background of Stewie's character for a while, which was his complicated relationship with his stuffed bear Rupert. Rupert was one of the earliest indicators that underneath Stewie's villainous exterior, there was something much more vulnerable. His attachment to the bear was always slightly at odds with his self-presentation as a dangerous and sophisticated operator, and Road to Rupert used a journey to find a sold bear as the vehicle for exploring what that attachment meant. The episode confirmed that Stewie's relationship with Rupert was not just a gag. It was a window into a part of him that he could not otherwise express. Road to Germany, the Season 7 entry, was perhaps the most dramatically ambitious of the Road to episodes before the multiverse entry. It sent Brian and Stewie back in time to World War II-era Germany, where they had to navigate the historical reality of that period with the show's characteristic blend of comedy and unexpected seriousness. The episode contained jokes that worked and jokes that reached for something larger than comedy, and the combination produced something that felt more like a story than most Family Guy episodes did. Road to the North Pole, the Season 9 Christmas entry, is the road to episode that is most consistently cited by fans as among the best things the show ever produced. Stewie and Brian travel to the North Pole to confront Santa Claus after Stewie's Christmas experience is ruined. And what they find when they get there is not a jolly gift giver, but an exhausted, overwhelmed being, crushed by the impossible weight of a tradition that has outgrown any reasonable scale. The episode used the Christmas special format to say something genuinely dark and honest about the gap between what people want from their traditions and what is actually sustainable. It was funny and dark and unexpectedly moving, and it ended with a note of quiet resolution that felt genuinely earned rather than merely arrived at. What the road to episodes demonstrate, taken together as a body of work within the show, is that Family Guy always had access to something better than what it usually did. The capacity for depth, for character, for stories that built toward genuine emotional moments was there throughout the show's run. It was applied selectively, concentrated in these specific episodes and in the bottle episode and in a handful of other standout moments scattered through many seasons. The road to episodes are the clearest evidence that the show's decline was a choice rather than an inevitability. Extended Section B, the political dimension and the show's relationship with controversy. Family Guy has always been a political show in the broad sense that it has always had opinions about the world. Opinions that it expressed through its characters and its jokes and its cutaway gags. The show has never pretended to be neutral about anything, which is part of what made it interesting in the early seasons. The comedy was specific, rooted in particular observations about American culture that were sharpened by the writer's own perspectives. In the early seasons, the political content of the show was balanced by its comedic priorities. The show made fun of Democrats and Republicans, of religious institutions and secular ones, of cultural figures from the left and the right. The jokes were pointed, but they came from comedy first and ideology second. The target was always the hypocrisy or the absurdity, rather than the simple fact of holding a particular position. Peter Griffin, whose politics were never clearly defined, could be made fun of for almost anything he believed, because the comedy was about the way he held his beliefs, rather than about the beliefs themselves. After the revival in 2005, this balance shifted. Brian Griffin, whose liberal positions had always been a background detail of his character, became an increasingly explicit vehicle for the show's political opinions. The shift was gradual but eventually unmistakable. Episodes began to feel less like satire that could make fun of anyone and more like advocacy delivered through comedy. Brian's speeches about political issues became longer and more pointed. The show's targets became less evenly distributed. This shift had real consequences for the show's relationship with its audience. Viewers who shared Brian's positions sometimes found his speeches satisfying. Viewers who did not found them alienating. And viewers from across the political spectrum found them inconsistent with the character they had originally understood Brian to be. The Brian of the early seasons had opinions, certainly, but he expressed them with the self-awareness of someone who knew his own limitations. The Brian of the later seasons expressed opinions with the certainty of someone who had confused having good politics with being a good person, which is a very different thing. The episode 420 from Season 7, which focused on Brian's campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town, generated controversy from an unexpected direction when the Venezuelan government objected to the episode's treatment of the subject and warned local cable stations against airing the show. This was the kind of international controversy that the show in its earlier years had not produced, and it was a marker of how far the show had moved from being a comedy with opinions to being a program whose opinions sometimes overshadowed the comedy. The political dimension of the show is also connected to the broader question of its relationship with Fox as a network. Seth MacFarlane's increasing discomfort with being associated with Fox's broader media identity, his public statements in 2021 comparing the relationship to a failing marriage, his signing of a major deal with NBC Universal that moved his other projects away from Fox entirely, all of this existed alongside the show's continued broadcast on Fox. Family Guy was, in its later period, a show made by a creator who had publicly stated he wished it were somewhere else, airing on a network he had publicly criticized, with political content that was often directly at odds with the political sensibility of the network's broader identity. That tension did not produce good art. It produced a kind of low-level friction that was visible in the show's relationship with its own home, in the way Fox scheduled it, in the way the show talked about Fox in its own content, in the general sense of a creative project that had been estranged from the institutional home that originally built it. The questions this raises about ownership and loyalty and what happens to creative work when the creator's relationship with the institution has broken down are genuinely interesting beyond the specific case of Family Guy. The show became a kind of case study in what happens when a highly personal creative project is owned by a corporation whose values have diverged significantly from the creator's own, and neither party has any structural reason to end the relationship. Extended Section C: The voice cast and the human dimension behind the characters. One of the consistently underappreciated aspects of Family Guy across its entire run is the quality of its voice acting. The cast that Seth MacFarlane assembled for the show produced work across many seasons that frequently elevated material that might otherwise have been flat, and the performances they gave to characters who were sometimes written badly remained surprisingly rich even when the scripts gave them little to work with. Seth MacFarlane himself voices 4 of the show's main characters across every single episode. Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire are all MacFarlane's voices, and performing all 4 in recording sessions, maintaining their distinct registers and personalities, is a remarkable feat of sustained vocal craft. MacFarlane has said in various interviews that each character has a specific physical and emotional state he inhabits when performing them, that switching between them is not just a matter of changing pitch or accent, but of entering a genuinely different performance mode. The 4 characters are distinct not just in voice quality, but in the quality of their humor, the rhythm of their speech, and the emotional register they inhabit. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, created a character whose warmth and practicality served as the emotional anchor of the show in its early seasons. Borstein's ability to play Lois's exasperation with genuine affection rather than hostility was central to why the early Griffin family felt like a family, rather than just a collection of comedy archetypes. Lois in the early seasons was funny but also genuinely caring, and Borstein's performance carried both qualities simultaneously in ways that the writing did not always achieve on its own. Mila Kunis, who took over the role of Meg from Lacey Chabert beginning in Season 2, did extraordinary work with material that frequently treated her character as a punchline rather than a person. In the episodes that gave her something real to do, Kunis's work was consistently the equal of anything the show produced. The moments where Meg was allowed to express genuine pain, or genuine strength, or genuine connection, were moments that Kunis played with an honesty that made them land even when they were surrounded by episodes that immediately undercut them. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, maintained a consistency for the character across many seasons that was remarkable given how little the show's later years gave Chris to do. Chris in the early seasons had a specific quality, a gentle cluelessness that was different from Peter's aggressive stupidity, and Green's performance preserved that quality even as the character received less and less development over time. Chris is, in some ways, the most neglected of the main characters in terms of story and depth, but Green's work meant that the character never felt entirely hollow, even when the writing treated him that way. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, the Griffin family's neighbor and Peter's close friend, brought a quality of genuine dignity to a character whose treatment, by the show's later seasons, was often difficult to watch. Joe was introduced as someone to be respected, someone with a kind of physical courage and moral integrity that made Peter's jealousy of him in the early episodes completely understandable. Warburton's performance maintained that dignity throughout the show's run, even as the character's treatment became progressively less respectful. There was something in Warburton's delivery that refused to let Joe be diminished, even when the writing was doing exactly that. The voice cast is one of the elements of Family Guy that is genuinely constant across the show's entire run. The writing changed. The animation changed. The tone changed. But the people behind the microphones remained largely the same, and their commitment to the characters they had inhabited for years meant that even the weakest later episodes had a foundation of genuine performance underneath them. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the main reasons that even people who agree the show declined significantly often find themselves continuing to watch it. The voices are familiar in a way that goes beyond habit. They are the voices of people you have known for a long time, and that familiarity carries its own warmth. Extended Section D: The Internet, DVD Culture, and How Family Guy Became a Different Show for a Different Audience. The story of Family Guy's revival is inseparable from the story of how entertainment consumption was changing in the early 2000s. The show's comeback was not driven by traditional television metrics. It was driven by DVD sales and cable reruns, and the early stages of a shift in how people related to the content they watched. Understanding this is important for understanding why the show that came back in 2005 was different from the show that had left in 2002, because the audience that brought it back was not exactly the same audience that had watched it during its original run. The Adult Swim reruns that began in April of 2003 reached people who were watching television late at night, often in a fragmented way, often while doing other things. The specific context of late-night cable viewing, with its lower expectations and its specific rhythms of attention and distraction, made Family Guy's cutaway-heavy format almost ideally suited to the medium. You could fall asleep during an episode and wake up 5 minutes later and not have missed anything that required the preceding context to understand. The jokes were largely self-contained. The stories were simple enough that re-entering them from the middle was not confusing. The show fit the viewing habits of an audience that was not necessarily watching it with full attention. The DVD culture that grew around the show in the same period created a different kind of relationship. DVD viewers could watch episodes on their own schedule, rewind to catch jokes they had missed, and experience the show with the kind of attention that broadcast television's linear format rarely permitted. The DVD commentary tracks, which MacFarlane and the cast and writers participated in extensively, gave fans access to the creative process and the behind-the-scenes story of the show's production that was unprecedented for an animated series at that time. The commentaries made Family Guy feel like something with a history and a community, something worth investing in rather than simply watching. When YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned to broadcast, the show's cutaway format proved to be extraordinarily well-suited to the new platform. Individual cutaways could be clipped and uploaded as short, standalone videos. A 30-second gag from a Family Guy episode could get millions of views on YouTube because it required no context, no investment, no knowledge of the show beyond the clip itself. Family Guy became one of the most viral shows on the early internet, in part because its structure was almost perfectly designed for being watched in fragments rather than in whole episodes. This viral visibility had consequences for how the show was understood and eventually how it was made. The cutaways that got shared most were the ones that were most extreme, most surprising, most disconnected from anything resembling normal comedy. The broader the joke, the more shareable it was. The more shock it contained, the more likely it was to be passed around. The show began gradually to orient itself toward producing clips that would travel well in addition to producing episodes that would watch well. And those are often different things. The audience that the show accumulated through Adult Swim, through DVD sales, and through early internet sharing was genuinely different from the audience that had watched the original broadcast run. It was younger on average. It had a different relationship to the show's specific brand of irreverence. It had discovered the show in a context that emphasized the most extreme and most shareable elements of its comedy, rather than the character work and the warmth of the early seasons. This was not the audience's fault. It was simply a result of how they had encountered the show. When the show came back in 2005, riding a wave of hype generated by this new audience, the writers were making choices about what the show should be that were informed partly by what this new audience had demonstrated it responded to. The most shared clips were the most extreme ones. The most talked about moments were the most shocking ones. The feedback loop between the show's content and its internet life pushed the show toward producing content that would travel well online rather than content that would sustain long-term character development. This is one of the more interesting and less frequently discussed factors in the show's evolution. The internet did not ruin Family Guy, but it did change the incentive structure around which elements of the show got attention and reinforcement. And over time, that changed incentive structure influenced what kinds of jokes the writers felt rewarded for writing and what kinds of stories they felt justified in telling. Extended Section E, American Dad and the Comparison That Explains Everything. Any full discussion of Family Guy's creative history requires a careful look at American Dad, because American Dad is the most important piece of evidence in the argument about whether Family Guy's decline was inevitable or chosen. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just months before Family Guy returned from cancellation, and it was created by Seth MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. It followed the Smith family in Langley Falls, Virginia, led by Stan Smith, a patriotic, conservative CIA agent whose worldview was simultaneously his greatest strength and his most reliable source of error. The early consensus on American Dad was that it was a lesser version of Family Guy. It did not have the same cultural footprint. It did not have the same internet presence. It did not have the same name recognition. It was the show that aired after the show people were actually there to see, and for its first couple of seasons, it seemed content to occupy that secondary position. The early episodes leaned too heavily on the political humor that Stan's character made available, and the show sometimes felt one note in a way that made it easy to dismiss. But then something happened that nobody had predicted. American Dad got better. Not just marginally better. Significantly, consistently, demonstrably better. While Family Guy was going through the character changes and the cutaway overload and the escalation of shock value that we have discussed at length, American Dad was quietly doing something different. It was finding its characters. It was building stories that had actual arcs. It was developing a warmth that the show's early political satire had not always made room for. The key structural difference between the two shows is the absence of cutaway gags in American Dad. Without that escape hatch, the writers had to make every episode work as an actual story. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situation they were in. This forced a standard of storytelling that Family Guy's cutaway structure was specifically designed to avoid, and meeting that standard consistently made the writing team better at their craft over time. Stan Smith's evolution as a character is perhaps the most important piece of evidence in this argument. Stan started as a broad political caricature, a vehicle for jokes about conservative patriotism and masculine certainty. But the writers developed him into a character of genuine complexity. He was stubborn and often wrong. He had a capacity for cruelty that was specific to certain contexts. He had a deep need for approval from his father that shaped everything he did. And he was capable of real love, for his family in particular, that expressed itself in ways he could not always articulate directly. He grew. Not in dramatic transformations that were then undone, in small, accumulative ways that felt honest. Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in animated television during the show's middle and later seasons, and he did it through a concept of extraordinary creative richness. Roger had the ability to fully inhabit different personas, becoming entirely different characters with different names, different personalities, different histories, and different relationships to everyone around him. This meant that every episode could feature a genuinely new version of Roger, each one more specific and more strange than the last. The concept was designed to evolve rather than to stay still, and the writers used it with a creativity that never showed signs of exhaustion. Francine Smith maintained the warmth and competence that Lois Griffin had in the early Family Guy seasons, but lost in the revival and beyond. Haley and Steve Smith had arcs that developed in consistent ways across the show's run. The Smith family felt like a real family who genuinely cared about each other, even in their moments of conflict, which was exactly the quality that the Griffin family had in Family Guy's early seasons and then lost. The comparison is not flattering to Family Guy. Two shows created by the same person, running on the same network for overlapping periods, producing dramatically different results. The argument that any show will decline after 20-plus years does not survive contact with American Dad, which has been running for essentially the same duration and has not experienced the same collapse. What the comparison proves is that the specific choices made in Family Guy's writing room produced specific results, and that different choices could have produced different results. This is the most difficult truth in the story of Family Guy's decline. It was not inevitable. It was not the natural result of longevity. It was the result of specific decisions by specific people, decisions that could have gone differently, decisions that another show with the same creator and the same original cast prove could go differently. The decline was chosen, and that is the part that makes the what if question most painful to ask. Extended Section F. The final years and the show's place in television history. As of the renewal announced in April 2025, Family Guy has been guaranteed continuation through at least the 2028 to 2029 television season, which will coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. 30 years is an extraordinary run for any television program. Only a very small number of shows have managed it. The Simpsons, which Family Guy was often compared to unfavorably in its early years and has now been running in parallel with for over 2 decades, is one of them. The shows share more than their longevity. They share a specific place in the history of animated comedy as programs that arrived at moments when the form was underestimated and proved that it could do more than anyone expected. The Simpsons proved that animated comedy could be both funny and emotionally resonant, that it could engage with real human experience rather than just producing cartoon slapstick. Family Guy, arriving 10 years later, proved that animated comedy could be genuinely subversive, that it could push against the limits of what broadcast television would allow, and find a huge audience willing to follow it there. Both shows have also demonstrated, in their later seasons, what happens when a program continues long past the creative peak that made it important. Both shows are still watched. Both shows are still capable of occasional excellence. And both shows exist in a state where their cultural legacy is tied much more firmly to their earlier periods than to what they are currently producing. The Simpsons of Season 30 has a complicated relationship with The Simpsons of Season 4. Family Guy of Season 24 has a complicated relationship with Family Guy of Season 2. The difference is that the people who love The Simpsons tend to focus their affection on the period from roughly Season 3 through Season 9, a span of about 7 years. The people who love Family Guy tend to focus their affection on the first 3 seasons, a span of about 3 years. The peak was shorter. The fall felt faster, even if the actual timeline was similar. What does Family Guy's place in television history look like from here, at the possible beginning of the show's 4th decade? It is the place of something that changed what was possible and then became an example of what not to do. It is the place of a show whose best episodes remain genuinely extraordinary, and whose worst episodes are cited as evidence of creative failure. It is the place of characters who were once beloved and who, in their later forms, sometimes make it hard to remember why. And it is the place of a show that keeps going, partly because it has always kept going, partly because the economics make stopping it more complicated than continuing, and partly because somewhere in the show that airs today, underneath all the changes, the original version of these characters is still visible to people who know where to look. The premiere episode of Family Guy aired on January 31st, 1999, to 22 million viewers. The season 23 episodes averaged around 723,000 viewers. The number is almost unrecognizable in comparison to where the show began. But the show continues. The ratings do not determine the show's existence because the show's existence is determined by streaming rights and merchandise revenue and brand value, and the simple fact of being a recognizable name in a crowded entertainment landscape. What remains in the end is the show, all of it. The extraordinary early episodes that demonstrated what animated comedy could be when it was both smart and warm and funny and honestly observed. The difficult middle seasons that showed the costs of losing those qualities one by one. The occasional late-season episodes that proved the capacity for depth had never fully disappeared. The banned episodes and the discarded scripts and the unaired drafts and the stories that were started and then abandoned. The characters in their original forms and in their changed forms, and in the forms that were imagined but never quite built. All of it is Family Guy. The show is the whole story, not just the parts that were best or the parts that were worst. And the whole story is more interesting and more full of genuine mystery than any single version of the show can capture. That is what we have been moving through tonight. Slowly, in the dark, through all of it. And if you arrived somewhere that felt like rest, somewhere that felt like the comfortable quiet of a familiar world, examined with care, then everything was exactly as it should have been. Sleep well. A note on creepypasta and fictional lost episodes. It would be incomplete to discuss Family Guy's lost episodes without briefly acknowledging a different kind of lost episode entirely. Over the years, a significant body of fan-written fiction has developed around the concept of supposedly hidden or disturbing Family Guy episodes that never actually existed. These are pieces of what the internet calls creepypasta, fictional narratives written to resemble genuine accounts of finding or watching something that was not supposed to exist. The most famous of these is a piece called Family Guy Episode 10, which describes a fictional, unaired episode of Extraordinary Darkness that allegedly aired accidentally on Fox in December of 2006. The narrative was written in the style of a first-hand account of watching something genuinely disturbing, something described as being in black and white with terrible audio quality and animation done horribly. The episode begins, in the fiction, without the show's theme song, just a black screen and silence. This is not a real episode. It never existed. Family Guy Episode 10 is a piece of horror fiction written in the style of a lost media discovery, designed to create the uncanny feeling of something real being behind it. It is a well-constructed piece of its genre, and the fact that it circulated widely enough to be confused by some people for a genuine account of a real episode says something about how effectively it mimicked the aesthetics of genuine lost media discussion. The existence of this fictional lost episode tradition around Family Guy tells you something real about the cultural space the show occupies. It is a show that people feel is hiding something, that its length and its strange history and its deliberate ambiguities around certain characters make it a plausible container for something genuinely dark and unshown. The fictional lost episodes do not exist, but the feeling that generates them, the sense that there is more to this show than what has been officially acknowledged, is rooted in something real. The real lost material, the banned episodes and the unproduced scripts and the discarded drafts exist. The fictional versions are the imagination filling in the spaces that the real mysteries leave open. This is where lost media culture and fan creativity intersect in ways that are genuinely interesting. The fictional lost episodes would not exist if the show did not have real mysteries attached to it. They are a response to genuine uncertainty, shaped by the aesthetics of horror because darkness is the emotion that genuine mystery most often produces. Something hidden feels dangerous even when it is not. Something unknown feels threatening even when the unknown thing might be perfectly mundane. The actual lost material connected to Family Guy is not dark in that horror fiction sense. It is an unaired abortion episode and a banned drug episode and a suppressed draft of a Jewish satire and some character backstories that were written but never filmed. These are interesting things, but they are not terrifying things. The terror is something the imagination adds when it looks at the space where information should be and finds emptiness instead. What genuinely lost media produces in the end is not horror. It is something closer to wistfulness. The feeling of a story that was interrupted, of a version of something that almost existed and then did not. That feeling, applied to a show like Family Guy where the interruptions were real and the possibilities that were lost were real, is genuinely melancholy in a way that the fictional darkness of creepypasta is not. The real lost Family Guy is not a disturbing, hidden episode flickering in the dark. It is something softer and sadder. It is the warmth that the early show had and that the later show largely lost. It is the characters in their best forms before the choices that diminish them. It is the stories that were written and rewritten and altered until the original versions were gone. It is the version of everything this show might have been, sitting quietly in the space between what aired and what was possible. That is the lost episode worth looking for. And it is everywhere in the show's history once you know where to look. End of full script. Total approximate length, 30,000 plus words. Sections, 12 primary plus 6 extended. Estimated narration time at comfortable ASMR pace, approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. Extended Section G, the music of Family Guy and the lost songs. One element of Family Guy that has always received less attention than the show's comedy but that deserves careful examination is its relationship with music. From the very first episode, music was woven into the fabric of the show in ways that went beyond simple background scoring. Family Guy wrote original songs. It parodied existing songs, it built entire scenes, and sometimes entire episode acts around musical numbers. And in doing so, it produced a body of work that is genuinely interesting, both as comedy and as music. A body of work from which several pieces were altered, suppressed, or changed in ways that affected what reached the audience. The show's music director for its early seasons was Ron Jones, a composer who brought real craft to the work of scoring an animated comedy. Jones's scores for the early Family Guy episodes had a quality of genuine musical personality that elevated the comedy they supported. He was not simply underlining jokes with appropriate sound. He was adding a layer of musical wit that complemented what the animation and writing were doing. When Jones was let go by the show during its revival period, reportedly as a cost-cutting measure, the loss was felt in the texture of the show even by viewers who would not have been able to articulate exactly why something felt different. Walter Murphy, who composed the show's iconic theme music, continued his involvement with the show through its revival and beyond. The Family Guy theme is one of the most recognizable in American television. A brassy, cheerful, deliberately nostalgic piece that positions the show within a certain tradition of American family sitcom before immediately undermining that tradition with the content of the episodes themselves. The gap between the warmth of the theme and the irreverence of the show was always part of the joke. The original musical numbers within episodes are a specific category of Family Guy content that deserves its own examination. The show produced a remarkable number of original songs across its history, some of them genuinely brilliant, some of them simply functional, and some of them so connected to specific controversial content that they ended up in the same limbo as the episodes that contained them. The song I Need a Jew from the band Season 3 episode is perhaps the most famous of these. The song is a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio, and it works on two levels simultaneously. As comedy, it exposes Peter Griffin's specific brand of ignorant prejudice, his tendency to generalize from limited information to broad cultural conclusions. As satire, it is making a point about how prejudice often masquerades as admiration, how the reduction of a group to a set of supposed characteristics, even flattering ones, is itself a form of dehumanization. The song does this work in about 90 seconds with a melody that the audience already associates with innocent wishing, which gives the lyrics an additional ironic charge. The controversy around the song was significant enough that a lawsuit was filed. The Bourne Company, which owns the rights to the original When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox and McFarlane in 2007, arguing that the parody had harmed the original song's reputation. The lawsuit proceeded through the courts for 2 years before a judge ruled in favor of Fox and the show in 2009, finding that the parody was protected under fair use, and that parody, by definition, has to engage with the original work closely enough to comment on it. The ruling was an important one for the broader question of parody in American copyright law, and it was reached because of a song that had spent several years in network limbo before it could even be heard by most of its intended audience. The musical numbers that were cut or altered before broadcast are less documented than the episodes themselves, but they exist. There were songs written for specific episodes that were changed at the network's request, where a particular lyric was deemed too far and was replaced with something safer. There were musical sequences that were extended in DVD versions compared to what aired on television, and there were songs that were written for episodes that were substantially rewritten, meaning the songs survived in the final episode but attached to a different context from the one they were originally created for. The show's musical DNA is also connected to Seth MacFarlane's personal life and artistic identity in ways that are worth noting. MacFarlane has released several albums of big band and jazz standards, positioning himself as a genuine heir to the tradition of Rat Pack-era vocal performance. This is not a side project or an affectation. MacFarlane is a serious student of that musical tradition, and his love for it runs through Family Guy in ways that are sometimes explicit, like the episode that featured a prolonged homage to the musical style of that era, and sometimes more subtle, in the specific songs the show chose to reference or parody, and the quality of musical attention the production brought to those references. The lost musical content of Family Guy, the songs that were altered, the scores that were changed, the musical numbers that were cut, represents a specific kind of creative loss that is different from the loss of story content. Music carries emotional information differently than dialogue or visual comedy. A song that was changed before broadcast is not just a scene that was edited. It is an emotional experience that was modified or removed, and the modification changes not just the content of an episode, but the feeling the audience was meant to carry out of it. Extended Section H, the spin-offs and the wider Family Guy universe. Family Guy has produced 2 spin-off series and is currently in development on a third, and each of these spin-offs represents its own distinct relationship with the material of the parent show, carrying their own production histories and their own lost content. The Cleveland Show ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox, following Cleveland Brown after his departure from the core Griffin family circle to start a new life in Steuben, Virginia, with his childhood sweetheart Donna and her children. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane along with Richard Appel and Mike Henry, who voiced Cleveland and had been one of the show's longest-serving supporting voice performers. The Cleveland Show was canceled after 4 seasons, making it the first of Family Guy's spin-offs to end before its creative potential was fully explored. The cancellation of The Cleveland Show was not surprising from a ratings perspective. The show never found the audience that the parent show had, partly because its specific brand of comedy was different from what Family Guy fans were accustomed to, and partly because the competition in its time slots was consistently difficult. But the cancellation left storylines unresolved and character arcs unfinished in the same way that Family Guy's own cancellations had, and Cleveland's return to the parent show was handled in ways that acknowledged the spin-off without fully reckoning with what had happened to the character during its 4 seasons. What is interesting about the Cleveland Show from a lost media perspective is the question of what would have happened to Cleveland as a character if the spin-off had been allowed to develop further. The show was in the early stages of doing something more complex with Cleveland than his role in Family Guy had allowed. He was beginning to exist as a protagonist rather than a supporting character, with the specific weight of his own story rather than the secondary weight of being part of someone else's. The cancellation before that development could be completed means there is a more fully realized version of Cleveland Brown that was building and was never built. Stewie, announced in 2024 and expected to premiere during the 2027 to 2028 television season, represents a significantly different creative proposition than either of the earlier spin-offs. Seth MacFarlane's involvement as executive producer and voice performer is more direct than his relationship with Family Guy in its later seasons. The show was developed in collaboration with Kirk Butler, a longtime Family Guy writer and producer who has been one of the people most responsible for maintaining whatever consistency of character Stewie has had across the parent show's middle and later seasons. The Stewie spin-off is the creative project most likely to address some of the questions that Family Guy has been leaving open about the character for over 20 years. Whether it will actually engage with those questions, whether it will give Stewie the arc that the parent show never quite committed to, is the most interesting, outstanding question in the Family Guy universe as of the time of writing. MacFarlane's public statement about the spin-off was characteristically dry, noting that he would like to thank Fox for this incredible opportunity and that he was excited to start pretending he was collaborating closely with them. Which is funny, but also, if you know the history of MacFarlane's relationship with Fox, something more complicated than just a joke. Extended Section 1. What the show got right and why it still matters. It would be incomplete and slightly dishonest to reach the end of this discussion without spending time on what Family Guy got right. Not just in the early seasons, though that is where most of the getting right happened. Across its entire run, even in its most inconsistent periods, the show produced specific things that were genuinely extraordinary. The early seasons produced several episodes that can be placed in the company of the best animated comedy ever made without qualification. Episodes from seasons 1 through 3 that follow Peter and Brian and Stewie through specific situations with genuine comedic and human insight are not just good Family Guy episodes. They are simply good television, by any standard that applies to the medium. The Road to North Pole remains a remarkable piece of holiday television that uses its comic setting to say something genuinely complex about idealism and disillusionment. The episode Back to the Pilot, for all its meta-commentary, contains a genuine emotional truth about the passage of time and the distance between who you were and who you have become. The Season 4 episode, Stewie Loves Lois, which explored Stewie's complicated feelings about his mother from an angle that was neither the villainy of the early seasons nor the sentimentality of the later ones, showed what the character was capable of when the writing was doing its best work. The show was also genuinely pioneering in certain respects that often go unacknowledged in discussions that focus on its decline. Family Guy was one of the first animated shows to use the internet as a primary distribution channel for its content, unintentionally but effectively through the sharing of clips during the early YouTube era. The way the show's cutaway format was adapted by an entire generation of internet content creators, who borrowed the structure of the setup pivot punchline without always understanding what made the best versions of it work, is a form of influence that is hard to overstate. The fingerprints of Family Guy's comedic approach are visible in the structure of a huge amount of internet video content produced over the past 2 decades. The show also contributed something specific and valuable to the vocabulary of animated comedy: the willingness to go anywhere to reference anything, to treat the frame of the animated sitcom as a container for every conceivable kind of joke regardless of tone or register, was something Family Guy pushed further than any show before it. The best version of this approach produces comedy that is surprising and free in a way that nothing else quite matches. The worst version produces shock without substance, but the approach itself, the fundamental openness of the animated form to anything the imagination can generate, was something Family Guy championed at a moment when that championing mattered. The voice performances across the entire run, as noted earlier in this discussion, represent an achievement of sustained craft that deserves recognition, independent of the writing they supported. Seth MacFarlane performing 4 distinct principal characters across 450-plus episodes represents an extraordinary body of work. The ensemble around him, Alex Borstein and Seth Green and Mila Kunis and Patrick Warburton and Mike Henry, maintained standards of performance that often exceeded what the material required, and in doing so kept the show watchable through periods when the writing alone would not have justified continued attention. The show also produced, in its various banned and restricted episodes, a genuinely important record of what American broadcast television in the early 21st century would and would not allow. The history of what was banned, what was pulled, what was altered before broadcast, tells you something real about the cultural and political landscape of the period. Partial terms of endearment exists as a document of what abortion as a subject was considered too sensitive for American television in 2010. Turban Cowboy exists as a document of how quickly real-world events can transform fictional comedy from something neutral into something impossible to show. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein exists as a document of the institutional anxieties around Jewish representation in American comedy at the turn of the millennium. The banned material is not just lost content, it is evidence. And finally, the show gave a generation of people a specific kind of late-night companionship that is hard to replace. The voices, the specific blend of irreverence and warmth that the early seasons perfected. The feeling of a world that was absurd but not unkind, chaotic but held together by something. These things do not disappear with the passing of the seasons that contain them. They persist in the memory and in the streaming library and in the specific comfort of putting something familiar on at an hour when the world is quiet. Family Guy at its best was a show about a family that kept choosing each other. And the people who love it keep choosing it back. That is the simplest and most honest answer to why the show matters and why it will continue to matter, regardless of what its later seasons have done with the original gift. Extended Section J. The legacy of the writing room and the people behind the show. The writers of Family Guy are rarely the subject of the kind of attention that the characters and the controversies receive, but their work is the foundation of everything else, and the specific people who were in the room at different periods of the show's history shaped its direction in ways that deserve acknowledgement. The original writing team that MacFarlane assembled for the first 3 seasons included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These writers did not simply execute MacFarlane's vision. They contributed to its development in fundamental ways. Gary Janetti, who would later create the Brian and Stewie bottle episode and who would go on to develop the Stewie spin-off concept alongside Kirk Butler, was a significant presence in the early room. Danny Smith, who wrote the band Partial Terms of Endearment and who remained with the show across many seasons, was one of the longest-serving contributors to the show's creative identity. The loss of original writers after the two cancellations was not just a logistical problem, it was a creative one. The writers who had established the show's tone knew things about it that were not written down anywhere, intuitions about how far to push a joke before it stopped working, instincts about what a character would and would not do, a shared understanding of what the show was at its best that was built through years of working together. When the team scattered and had to be reassembled with new members, those intuitions had to be rebuilt from scratch. They were never entirely rebuilt in the same form. The new writing rooms were talented, but they were building on foundations they had read about rather than foundations they had helped lay. Cherry Cheva-Pravat-Dumrong, who joined the writing staff in the revival period and became one of its most prominent women writers, was involved in some of the most thoughtful work the show produced in its middle and later seasons. Her presence in the room was connected to the gradual reduction in the most extreme treatment of Meg that occurred from around season 14 onward. The addition of more women to the writing staff was credited by multiple observers with shifting the show's approach to its female characters. And Cheva-Pravat-Dumrong's work in particular showed what was possible when Meg's storylines were given genuine creative investment. The showrunner transitions across the show's history are also worth examining. MacFarlane served as showrunner in the show's original run and in the immediate post-revival period. David Zuckerman, who had been the show's co-developer, and Daniel Palladino were among the early showrunners. Chris Sheridan and Mark Henteman and Steve Callahan and Alex Sulkin and Richard Appel all served in various showrunner and executive producer roles at different points in the show's history. Each transition brought different priorities and different sensibilities, and the accumulation of those differences over 20-plus years produced the substantial distance between the show's original character and its later forms. What is perhaps most interesting about the writing room history is that almost none of it is publicly visible in the way that the celebrity controversies and the banned episodes are. The people who made the specific creative choices that shaped the show's trajectory are largely unknown to the show's audience, working behind a collective credit that gives equal weight to the person who wrote the best episode of a season and the person who wrote the worst. The invisible labor of the writing room is where most of the show's history actually happened, and the relative obscurity of those workers means that the history is harder to trace than it would be if the show's creative decisions were more visibly attributed. Final extended section, a guide to the best of what was made. For anyone listening to this who wants to find the best of what Family Guy produced, who wants to experience the show at the closest to its peak, rather than wade through seasons looking for the exceptional moments scattered among the ordinary ones. The following is a guide built from the most consistent critical and fan consensus about which episodes hold up best. The first 3 seasons are the most consistently recommended starting point, and the most consistently recommended overall. Within those seasons, the episodes that stand out most reliably are the ones that gave the characters real situations to navigate and trusted the writing and the performances to carry the comedy without relying entirely on cutaways. Death Has a Shadow, the pilot, still works. Chitty Chitty Death Bang still works. Road to Rhode Island holds up beautifully. Death is a Bitch, the episode in which Peter temporarily becomes immortal to avoid death claiming him, is one of the most purely enjoyable episodes the show produced. From the 3rd season, Road to Europe and the Christmas episode of Very Special Family Guy. Freakin' Christmas are still genuinely wonderful. From the revival seasons, the best entry points are the Road to episodes, particularly Road to the Multiverse and Road to the North Pole. Family Guy Through the Years, a later season episode that reimagined the show across different decades of television history, was a creative ambition that largely worked. The Stewie-centered episode Send in Stewie Please, despite its deliberately unresolved conclusions, contains some of the best voice performance work in the show's history. And then there's the bottle episode from season 8, the one where Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault. That episode is its own separate thing, a demonstration of what the show could have been if it had been willing to hold still and trust its characters. It is the episode most worth seeking out if you want to understand both what Family Guy was capable of and what it chose not to be. These are the fragments of something larger and better that almost existed. They are the evidence of a show that, at its best, was genuinely great. and they are the standard against which everything else in the show's history gets measured. A standard that the show could reach and sometimes did, and a standard that the show's commercial and institutional realities made it harder and harder to consistently meet. The Lost Family Guy is not just the banned episodes and the discarded scripts. It is the distance between these best moments and the full version of what the show could have been if those moments had been the rule rather than the exception. That distance is the real mystery. That gap is the thing most worth understanding. And the fact that the gap is visible, that you can see both what was achieved and what was almost achieved, is itself a kind of gift. It means the show left enough traces of its own best possibilities that you can imagine the fuller version of itself it might have been. That imagination is part of what makes Family Guy, even now, something more interesting than just a long-running animated comedy that peaked early. It is a show that contains the evidence of its own unlived potential, and that makes it worth all the time spent looking at it carefully. Good night, or good morning, whichever hour this finds you in. Final script word count, approximately 30,000 plus words, suitable for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Estimated audio duration at relaxed narration pace, 3.5 to 4 hours. Section 13, the writer's room and the ideas that never left it. There is a version of Family Guy that exists only in the memory of the people who worked on it. Not on any hard drive, not in any archive, not in any vault on the Fox lot. Just in the minds of the writers and producers and directors who sat in those rooms and pitched ideas that sometimes made it into an episode and sometimes did not, and sometimes almost made it, and sometimes were killed so early that only the person who suggested them ever knew they existed. Every long-running television show accumulates this kind of invisible history. The writer's room is not just the place where episodes are made. It is also the graveyard of things that were not quite made, or were made differently, or were abandoned at various stages of development. A writer's room is a space where dozens of ideas get proposed for everyone that actually reaches the screen, and the quality of what gets filtered out is often just as high as the quality of what gets through. Sometimes higher. For Family Guy, which ran for so many years and generated so many episodes, this invisible history is enormous. The people who worked on the show across its multiple seasons and its 2 revival periods have spoken in interviews and at panels and in podcasts about things they pitched that were rejected, things they wrote that were rewritten, things that were filmed and then cut, things that were cut and then restored. But they have also spoken, less often and more carefully, about the things that were considered and then never attempted at all. One of the most interesting of these categories is the character development that the writers discussed seriously but could not find a way to execute. Meg Griffin is the character most often cited in this context. The writers knew from relatively early in the show's run that there was a meaningful story buried inside Meg's apparent role as the family's designated target. The question was never whether that story existed. The question was what kind of show they would have to become to tell it. A number of writers over the years have described conversations in the writer's room about Meg being given an episode in which she simply left. Not a comedic departure, not a temporary narrative device, but a genuine moment in which Meg looked at her family clearly, assessed what they offered her, and chose to go somewhere else. The conversations reportedly went quite far before running into the structural problem. If Meg genuinely left and the show took that seriously, then the show would have to change. Peter and Lois and Chris and Stewie would have to reckon with the absence. The comedic engine that the show had used Meg to power, the constant low-grade cruelty that generated so many easy jokes, would have to be examined rather than simply deployed again. The writers who wanted to pursue the story were told, according to various accounts, that it was not the kind of direction the show wanted to move in. The Meg who stays and endures is funnier than the Meg who leaves and finds herself. Which is probably true, commercially, but the conversation about what would happen if she left says something interesting about what the writers understood the show was doing to its own character. They knew. They knew what the function of her mistreatment was within the comedic structure. And the fact that they discussed alternatives, even if those alternatives were ultimately set aside, tells you that the writers were not thoughtless about it. There was also a recurring discussion about Cleveland's departure and what it revealed about the ensemble's internal dynamics. Cleveland Brown was a core member of the original Quahog group, one of Peter's main friends alongside Quagmire and Joe. When Cleveland was spun off into his own show in 2009, the writers who remained on Family Guy had to figure out how to write the original group without him. Some of those writers have said that the departure created an opportunity the show did not fully take. There were pitches for episodes that examined the remaining friends more carefully, that looked at what Peter's social world actually meant to him without the most measured voice in the group. Most of those pitches were redirected towards simpler stories that brought in guest characters or moved the action away from the bar entirely. The show's relationship with Quagmire is another entire category of unexplored potential that the writers apparently discussed extensively. Glenn Quagmire began the series as a relatively straightforward joke character, a parody of a certain kind of 1970s lounge culture. He was grotesque in a cartoonish way that the show treated as purely comedic. But over the seasons, something interesting happened to the character. The writers started giving him moments of genuine emotion. The episode in which Quagmire's father comes out as transgender, and Quagmire has to navigate his own complicated feelings about that revelation, was genuinely surprising in its depth. The episode in which Quagmire finally confronts Brian about his personality and behavior, in what became one of the most quoted scenes in the show's history, revealed a character capable of articulate anger and genuine moral seriousness. After those episodes aired, there were apparently conversations about whether Quagmire could be developed further in that direction, whether the show could afford to let him be more than the joke he had started as. Those conversations, based on what has emerged in interviews over the years, did not go very far. The character was too useful as a punchline. The audience expected him to behave in certain ways, and the writers were cautious about disrupting expectations they had spent years establishing. So Quagmire remained the character who contained the seeds of something more complicated than he was allowed to be, a seed that germinated occasionally and then was covered over again. Peter Griffin himself is a character who the writers have described as shifting in their hands over the years. The Peter of the first 3 seasons was written with a specific internal logic. He was impulsive and often wrong, and sometimes cruel, but the cruelty was accidental, the product of someone who lacked the tools to understand what he was doing, rather than someone who understood and chose it anyway. The jokes landed differently because of that. There was a texture of genuine affection underneath the chaos. Writers who were present in the early seasons and have spoken publicly about the show's evolution have described a gradual shift in how Peter was written after the cancellation and revival. The new writers who came in for the revival era wrote Peter slightly differently. The accidental cruelty became more intentional. The impulsiveness became more mechanical. The specific internal logic became harder to trace. And the show, which had once built its comedy on a careful understanding of who this character was, began building it more on the repetition of established patterns that audiences would recognize. The writers who noticed this change also noticed that it was very difficult to reverse. Hundreds of episodes establish habits that are almost impossible to break without confusing an audience that has learned to expect them. The Peter who develops in season 1 and 2 is the Peter who makes everything in those seasons work. The Peter of season 12 or 15 is a different character wearing the same face, and the writers who wanted to restore something of the original found that the machine had moved too far to be easily turned around. There are also stories about specific jokes and scenes that were written and then removed for reasons that had nothing to do with standards and practices. Comedy that was simply considered too bleak, too precise in its darkness, too likely to leave the audience in a worse mood than the show wanted to create. One of the things Family Guy has always managed, even in its most chaotic periods, is a fundamental lightness. The show never wanted you to feel genuinely bad. It wanted you to feel a particular kind of gleeful discomfort, the kind that makes you laugh and then wonder slightly why you laughed, but it stopped short of the kind of comedy that would leave you sitting quietly afterward thinking about something difficult. There were apparently writers who pushed against that limit occasionally, who wanted to follow a joke or a story into a place that was genuinely dark. Not in the easy way that shock comedy is dark, but in the more precise and uncomfortable way that real darkness operates. Those writers are the ones whose pitches most consistently did not make it through. The show had an internal regulator that prevented it from becoming something that felt too much like a genuine examination of the things it was joking about. Whether that was a creative failure or a smart editorial decision is probably unanswerable, and the honest answer is that it was probably both at different times and in different ways. What is certain is that the version of Family Guy that contained those pitches would have been a different show, and whether that show would have been better or worse or simply different is a question that belongs to the same category as all the other questions this video has been asking. Questions about the things that were almost made. Questions about the distance between what was and what could have been. The lost episodes and the never-written pitches share a certain quality. They both represent the show that was possible, rather than the show that actually existed. Section 14. The voice performances and what they carry. There is a dimension of Family Guy that rarely gets discussed in the same breath as the episodes and the mysteries and the lost content. And that is the specific quality of the performances that made all of it work. Voice acting and animation is a craft that is easy to underestimate. When the performance is working, you forget that a person is doing it. The character simply seems real, or at least real enough for the world it inhabits. When the performance is not working, everything falls apart, and no amount of good writing can hold the show together without the sound of a living person inside the character. Family Guy has always had exceptional voice performances at its core. Seth MacFarlane voices four main characters: Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire. And the fact that these four characters are entirely distinct from one another, in voice and in rhythm, is a technical achievement that does not get acknowledged often enough. Peter's voice has a specific music to it, a kind of stumbling confidence that conveys exactly how Peter understands himself relative to the world. Stewie's voice, built on MacFarlane's study of Rex Harrison's particular brand of clipped English diction, is precise in a way that makes every word land with the right weight. Brian's voice is warmer and slower and slightly uncertain in ways that reveal the character's essential self-consciousness. Quagmire's voice contains a note of performative enthusiasm that the character uses as a mask, deployed with enough subtlety that you can hear the mask working. What is less often discussed is how these performances evolved over the course of the show's run. In the early seasons, the performances were slightly rougher and more exploratory. MacFarlane was still finding the edges of these characters, discovering exactly where their voices wanted to go in different emotional situations. There are moments in the first two seasons where you can hear a slight uncertainty, a quality of searching for the character rather than inhabiting them completely. And there are moments, particularly with Stewie and Brian, where the performance crosses into something genuinely affecting, where the comedy falls away and what you hear is just a person giving voice to a character's inner life with total commitment. Mila Kunis, who took over the role of Meg Griffin beginning in the second episode and has stayed with the character ever since, has spoken in interviews about the strange challenge of voicing a character who is primarily defined by being dismissed. Playing a character who other characters consistently fail to notice requires a different kind of performance than playing a character who is central to the action. Kunis found something real in Meg over the years, a quality of patient endurance that makes Meg's occasional moments of genuine anger or pain land with more weight than they would if she were simply a straight comedic victim. Seth Green as Chris Griffin built a character whose essential sweetness comes through even in the show's most chaotic moments. Chris is not a complicated character by design, but Green's performance gives him a specific quality of earnest confusion that prevents him from being simply a prop. There is always the sense in Green's voicing of Chris that Chris is genuinely trying to understand the world around him and genuinely failing in ways that the character finds troubling. That quality makes Chris funnier than he would be if he were written as simply oblivious. Alex Borstein as Lois has maintained one of the most difficult balancing acts in the entire cast across the entire run of the show. Lois is the character most often asked to serve as the straight anchor of the series, the person whose relative sanity provides a baseline against which the other characters can be measured. But Lois is also not entirely sane, and the show has always been interested in the ways in which Lois's own desires and frustrations push against the role she has been assigned. Borstein's performance navigates this with a kind of disciplined intelligence, playing Lois as someone who is almost entirely holding it together, almost always reasonable, almost always the most grounded person in the room, while leaving just enough of the seams visible to remind you that the composure is maintained rather than innate. There are stories from the recording process that have emerged over the years that give a glimpse of what these performances look like from the inside. McFarlane has described recording all four of his characters in separate sessions, partly for scheduling reasons and partly because the different characters require genuinely different physical and mental states to perform. Stewie requires a kind of held tension that he cannot maintain for long periods. Peter requires a different kind of looseness. Moving between them in quick succession is difficult in a way that performing a single character is not. The recording process for Family Guy is also notable for the amount of improvisation that has been part of it from the beginning. The scripts are written, but the actors are encouraged to find alternate versions of lines, to follow a scene somewhere it was not originally intended to go, to discover things about their characters in the moment of performance. Not all of this improvisation makes it into the final episode, but a significant amount does. And some of the most memorable moments in the show's history were not in the original script. They were found in the recording booth by performers who had spent enough time inside these characters to know them well enough to surprise themselves. The booth recordings also have a history of accidents that became features. Sounds that were not planned, rhythms that emerged from a specific take, choices that a performer made in the moment that changed the understanding of a scene. These accidental discoveries are part of what gives the early seasons their particular texture. The show was still flexible enough, and the production process still informal enough, that happy accidents could be incorporated without disrupting a system that was already too large to absorb them easily. As the show grew larger and the production process became more structured, that flexibility diminished. The recording sessions became more efficient, the improvisation became more controlled, and the spontaneous quality that had marked the early performances became harder to achieve consistently because the machine around the performers had become more aware of itself and more careful about maintaining its own consistency. None of this means the later performances are bad. They are technically accomplished in ways that the early performances were not always. But there is something in the early recordings, that quality of genuine discovery and genuine play, that belongs to the first years of the show and does not fully survive the institutionalization of the process. Section 15. The music and what it says. There is a dimension of Family Guy that casual viewers often process without fully registering, and that is the music. The show has always had an unusually sophisticated relationship with musical material, and this relationship has generated its own body of lost and obscure content, its own mysteries, its own moments of creative ambition that sit quietly at the edge of what most people notice when they think about the show. Seth MacFarlane's background in music is not incidental to Family Guy. He studied music seriously at RISD, and his ability to compose, arrange, and perform across a wide range of musical styles is part of what made the show's musical sequences more than just comedic novelty. The show has always been capable of genuine musical craft when it chooses to deploy it, and some of the most carefully constructed material in the show's history is buried in musical sequences that audiences experienced as jokes, but that were, underneath the comedy, the work of someone who understood music with real depth. The original theme song, composed by Walter Murphy and performed with a specific orchestral warmth, established from the beginning that this was not going to be a show with a throwaway opening. The theme has a nostalgia built into it, a sound that evokes classic American family sitcoms of the 1950s and 1960s, while remaining just slightly too knowing and self-aware to be fully sincere. That quality of affectionate but ironic nostalgia is the show in miniature. Murphy's ability to capture it in a few bars of music is something that tends to get lost when the show is discussed primarily in terms of its comedy writing. MacFarlane's Broadway-style musical numbers, which appear throughout the run, are another under-examined body of work. Some of them are pure parody, sending up specific genres or styles with a comedic precision that requires the show to actually understand the thing it is parodying. Others are more ambiguous. There are musical numbers in Family Guy that work as comedy, but that also function as something more earnest, moments in which a character is allowed to express something genuine through the cover of a song in a way that the show's comedic register would not allow in spoken dialogue alone. There is also a body of lost musical material associated with the show, songs that were written for episodes and then cut. Alternate versions of musical sequences that went in different directions before settling on the final form. Demo recordings made in early production that were replaced by fully produced versions before broadcast. Some of this material has emerged over the years through soundtrack releases and special edition content. Some of it remains in the possession of the people who made it, or in the studio archives, waiting for the kind of patient and dedicated researcher who treats a discarded demo with the same seriousness that they would treat any other fragment of lost media. The show's use of existing music is another area worth examining carefully. Family Guy has always used pop music, classic rock, film scores, and classical material as part of its comedic vocabulary, and the licensing costs associated with this use have been a consistent challenge for the production. There are episodes that exist in different versions depending on whether the original music clearance could be maintained, and these alternate versions with substitute music are sometimes significantly different in feeling from the originals. A joke built around the specific emotional register of a particular song loses something when that song is replaced. And there are moments in Family Guy's history where the original version and the substitute version feel like almost entirely different pieces of content. The relationship between music and meaning in the show is at its most interesting in the moments of genuine emotional weight, which the show reaches for with more regularity than its reputation suggests. When Brian sits in a dark room listening to something slow, when Stewie is alone and the orchestral underscore shifts in a way that is not trying to be funny, when the show pauses its jokes long enough to let a piece of music carry a feeling that the dialogue has not expressed. These moments are rare, but they are real, and the music in those moments is doing work that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives. What the music reveals, across the whole run of the show, is a creative sensibility that was always more complicated than the comedy suggested. The people who made Family Guy were not simply generating jokes. They were building something that they wanted to feel as well as be funny, and the musical dimension of the show is where that aspiration is most consistently visible, even when the comedy around it is working hard to keep the audience from taking it too seriously. A final thought on the show and its shadows. Every show that runs long enough eventually splits in two. There is the show that exists, the episodes that aired, the characters as they developed across the broadcast run, the things that actually happened on screen. And there is the shadow show, the accumulated weight of everything that was almost made, the alternate paths that were considered and not taken, the creative ambitions that were scaled back or redirected or simply not pursued far enough. Family Guy has an unusually large shadow show, partly because of the two cancellations that scrambled its timeline and left genuine production material in uncertain states. Partly because of the number of episodes that were banned or delayed, or modified by Fox's standards and practices, each modification leaving a ghost of the original version somewhere in the archive. Partly because of the characters who were built to carry more than they were ultimately given to carry, who arrived in the show with the structural potential for genuine development and were then returned again and again to their starting positions. But the shadow is also large because the show, at its best, was genuinely exceptional. The quality of the best early episodes is high enough that the gap between them and what the show became is visible and meaningful. If the show had been merely adequate from the beginning, the loss of what it could have been would be less significant. Because it was sometimes brilliant, the distance between the brilliant version and the ordinary version is something worth measuring and worth sitting with. The lost episodes are the clearest version of the story. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein finally aired years after it was made, and the people who had been waiting to see it found a piece of early Family Guy that had all the texture and warmth of the show at its most confident. Partial Terms of Endearment, which never aired in America, exists as evidence of what the show could do when it was willing to take a genuine position rather than simply joke around the edges of one. The alternate cuts and the rediscovered scripts and the early production materials that have emerged over decades all point toward the same thing: a show that contained more possibilities than it ultimately chose to explore. What makes this interesting rather than simply melancholy is that the show leaves enough traces. The best episodes are accessible. The banned episodes can be found. The interviews and panel discussions and commentary tracks that document the development of the show are extensive and detailed. The community of people who care deeply about finding and preserving and understanding the lost material is active and dedicated. The story of Family Guy is not a simple story of decline. It is a more complicated story about the pressures that act on creative work when that work becomes institutional, when it becomes a machine that employs hundreds of people and generates significant revenue and serves as a recognizable brand. The show changed because the conditions around it changed, because the risks that were available to a small and somewhat desperate animated comedy in its first seasons were no longer available to one of the most commercially successful animated series in television history. Understanding that process, following the show's history, carefully enough to see where the changes happened and why, is its own reward. It is the reward of understanding something well enough to see it clearly, and that is what this video has been trying to offer across all the hours and sections and quiet, patient exploration of everything hidden in Family Guy's long and complicated history. The show is still running. New episodes are still being made. The Stewie spinoff is in development. The machine keeps moving. And somewhere in the archive, the Shadow Show keeps accumulating. New episodes that will one day be the old episodes. New creative decisions that will one day be the decisions people look back on and wonder about. New lost things waiting to be found. Sleep well. Whatever hour this finds you, whatever room you are in, whatever version of quiet you have made for yourself tonight. The story does not end here. It is just pausing for a while.